Bram Vickery didn't knock. He never knocked. The door of Eliza Renford's ranch house swung open like he owned the place because in his mind he already did. He stepped inside without wiping his boots, tracked mud across the floor she'd scrubbed that morning, and dropped a folded document onto her kitchen table like it was a bill of sale waiting for a signature. "Your husband's water filing," he said, not even looking at her. "There's a defect in it. A man could take you to court over something like that. Drain everything you've got just fighting it." He finally looked up, and his smile was the worst part. Calm, patient, like a man who had done this before and already knew how it ended. "Or you could save yourself the trouble and sell me the eastern pasture. Fair price, no court, no ruin." Eliza stood in her own kitchen in the house her husband built, on the land they had bled for together, and looked at a man who had just told her, without ever raising his voice, that he intended to take it from her. She was 35 years old. She had buried her husband 14 months ago. She had survived 2 Montana winters alone, lost 7 head of cattle to cold, fixed fences in the dark, and made every single decision by herself, since the morning she woke up and realized no one was ever going to help her carry this weight. And now Bram Vickery was standing in her kitchen, tracking mud on her clean floor, waiting for her to fold. If you've ever been told quietly, politely, with a smile that someone intends to take everything you've worked for and that your best option is simply to hand it over, then you already know exactly how Eliza felt in that moment. She didn't fold, but she also didn't know yet how she was going to fight. That is where this story begins. If this kind of story speaks to you, the ones about ordinary people who refuse to quit, who find unexpected help in unexpected places, and who discover that it's never too late to build something worth having, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. This one is worth staying for. Part 1, The Woman Who Refused to Leave. The storm came in from the northwest, and it came mean. Eliza had watched enough Montana March weather to know when the sky was serious. This one had been building since late afternoon, that particular shade of gray-green that didn't mean rain, it meant damage. She'd moved the 2 horses into the barn before dark, latched everything she could latch, and gone to bed telling herself that the roof had held for 11 years and it would hold one more night. It didn't. She heard the sound somewhere around 2 in the morning. Not a crack, not a bang, something worse. A slow grinding tear like the house itself was exhaling. Then cold, real cold, immediate and absolute, pouring through a gap that hadn't existed an hour before. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, standing in her bedroom doorway with a lantern, looking up at a section of roof that was now open to a Montana March sky. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She stood there for a long moment, holding the lantern, looking at the damage with the same expression she had learned to wear. For most things these past 14 months, the expression that wasn't quite composure and wasn't quite numbness, but lived somewhere in between. The expression that meant, "I'll figure this out. I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out." What she did after that first minute of standing and staring was get a bucket. Because the wind had shifted and it was starting to spit ice, and she was not going to let the floor rot on top of everything else. By morning, she had moved 3 buckets, and her back was announcing its opinion of that decision quite loudly. The light came gray and thin through the gap in the roof, illuminating a bedroom that now smelled like wet pine and cold dirt. Eliza made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and took stock of what she was actually dealing with. The roof was not something she could fix herself. She'd known that even in the dark. The ridge beam, the main support running the length of the house, had taken damage where it met the north wall. She could replace shingles. She'd done it. But a structural beam was a different conversation entirely, and she knew it, and she hated knowing it, because it meant she needed someone. Needing someone had gotten complicated since Thomas died. It wasn't that people in Copper Hollow were unkind. Most of them weren't. But there was a particular kind of attention that came with being a 35-year-old widow alone on 360 acres, and it wasn't always the helpful kind. There were men who offered assistance with the clear expectation that it would translate into something else eventually. There were women who offered sympathy with the equally clear expectation that Eliza would eventually do the sensible thing and sell the property and go back east where she belonged. And there were a handful of people who were genuinely decent and genuinely wanted to help, but who also genuinely couldn't, because fixing a structural ridge beam required someone who actually knew what they were doing. She needed a carpenter, a real one. She'd heard the name Silas Reddick mentioned twice in the past year once by the man at the feed store who'd told her Reddick had rebuilt the whole east wall of a barn outside of Millhaven after a collapse, and once by her neighbor Ruth Calloway, who had mentioned him the way you mention someone whose work speaks for itself and doesn't require elaboration. Never left a job unfinished, Ruth had said. Never left a job wrong either. Eliza sent the message through the feed store, because that was how things moved in this part of Montana, word of mouth, third hand, the informal network of people who knew people. She had no idea if Reddick would come or when or what he charged. He arrived 4 days later. She was on the barn roof when she heard the horse come up the lane, and she stayed where she was not out of stubbornness, exactly. But because she was halfway through reseeding a loose shingle, and she didn't see why a visitor should change that. She finished the shingle, drove the last nail, and then stood up on the barn roof and looked down at the man sitting on the gray horse in her yard. He looked about 55, maybe older. It was hard to tell. The kind of weathering that comes from decades of outdoor work makes a man's age ambiguous. You can see the years in his face, but you can't count them accurately. He was lean without being thin, sat a horse the way that people do when riding has become something they do without thinking about it. And he was looking at the gap in her house roof with an expression that she recognized immediately because she wore it herself sometimes. The expression of a person calculating, not catastrophizing. He hadn't noticed her yet, or he had noticed her and chosen not to react, which she would later learn was more likely. Mr. Reddick, she called down. He looked up without startling. Mrs. Renford. He glanced at the shingle she'd just finished. Barn roof? Loose nail. I found it this morning. He nodded once, as if a woman fixing her own barn roof before her hired carpenter arrived was simply information and not a statement. Mind if I look at the house? That's what I sent for you for. She came down off the barn roof carefully, because she was not going to fall off her own barn in front of a stranger. Thank you. And followed him around to the north side of the house, where the damage was worst. Silas dismounted and tied the gray horse Temperance, she'd find out later, which was a name that told you something about the man who gave it to the fence post. Then stood back and looked at the roof with the particular stillness of someone who has looked at a lot of damaged structures and learned that the first thing you do is look, not touch. How old is the house? He asked. 11 years. Thomas built it the first summer we came out. Silas walked the perimeter, looking up, saying nothing. He crouched at one corner and looked at the foundation. He walked to the north wall and pressed his hand flat against the siding for a moment, not testing anything she could identify, just feeling. The ridge beam where it meets the north wall, he finally said. That's the source. Everything else is downstream from that. I know, she said. Can you fix it? He looked at her for the first time since he'd ridden up. Not a quick glance, a real look, the kind that takes a second or two and is actually seeing something. Yes, he said. How long? Depends on what I find when I open it up. A week, maybe 10 days if the wood underneath is worse than it looks from here. What are you charging? He named a figure. It was fairer than she'd braced for, actually, though she kept her expression neutral because she'd learned that showing relief had a way of shifting negotiations. All right, she said. When can you start? Tomorrow morning, Silas said. If that works for you, it works for me. He nodded, untied Temperance, and rode back down the lane without a great deal of ceremony. She watched him go and thought, that was a man who doesn't waste words. She would come to understand that this was one of the most accurate observations she had ever made about another person. He came back the next morning exactly when he'd said he would, which in Eliza's experience was already rarer than it should have been. He came with tools packed in organized leather rolls, a mule carrying lumber he'd sourced himself rather than asking her to arrange it, and he went to work without preamble. Silas Reddick worked the way certain people do not fast, not slow, but with a quality that was harder to name. Deliberate, maybe. Every motion had a destination. He didn't fuss. He didn't narrate what he was doing. He just did it. Eliza found herself watching him from the kitchen window sometimes, not because there was anything particularly dramatic to watch, but because there was something oddly calming about a person who knew exactly what they were doing and did it without performance. By the end of the first day, he'd opened up the roof section and confirmed what he'd suspected. The damage went deeper than the surface. The beam where it met the north wall had been compromised not just by the storm, she would understand later, but by a slow process that had been happening for years. Moisture getting in. Wood softening in places no one could see from outside. It's worse than the outside showed, he told her that evening, when she brought him coffee before he left. The beam needs to be replaced, not just repaired. I want you to know that before I get further in. Is it going to cost more? Some. I'll tell you a number tomorrow when I've seen the full extent. She waited. Most men, when they were about to tell a woman something that involved money and difficulty, prefaced it with explanations. Context softening. Silas didn't do that. He gave her information. She was starting to appreciate it. Thank you for telling me, she said. You're the one who has to decide, he said simply. And then he took his coffee, drank it in a few unhurried swallows, handed back the cup, and went to saddle temperance. That night, Eliza sat at her kitchen table and did the arithmetic. The money was tight. It had been tight since Thomas died, and it hadn't gotten meaningfully better, though it hadn't gotten catastrophically worse either. She had managed. She always managed. But a beam replacement was a larger expense than she'd planned for, and the cattle count was still down from last winter's losses, and she was behind on a fence section on the south pasture that needed professional attention before summer. She did the arithmetic 3 times. Each time it came out to the same answer. She could afford it, barely, if nothing else went wrong. Which was how everything felt all the time. I can manage if nothing else goes wrong. The exhausting thing about being a woman alone on a Montana ranch wasn't any one problem. It was the accumulation, the way there was always a next thing, and the next thing after that, and you could never fully solve anything, because solving one problem only cleared space for the next one to become visible. She put the numbers away and went to bed. She told herself she was fine. And she mostly was. Bram Vickery arrived on the 4th day. She was making lunch when she heard the horses plural, which already told her something, and looked out to see Vickery, and 2 of his ranch hands riding up like they'd been invited. Vickery was 63, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once, and had since decided it was done trying. He had money, real money, the kind that came from decades of consolidating land in a territory where consolidating land meant convincing people to sell, one way or another. Eliza went to the door before he could knock. She'd learned with Vickery that giving him the chance to initiate things was a disadvantage. Eliza, he said, like they were friends, Mr. Vickery. He looked past her into the house, taking in the evidence of repair work that displaced furniture, the tarps, the sound of Silas working overhead. Storm damage? Roof repair, she said. Was there something you needed? He smiled. It was the wrong kind of smile, the kind that didn't quite reach the eyes, the kind that already knows the answer to a question it hasn't asked yet. I heard you had some damage, he said. I thought I'd come by. Make sure you were managing. I'm managing fine. Good, good. He looked at the barn, then back at her. You know, I've been meaning to talk to you about the eastern pasture. I'd like to expand my grazing access through there. I think we could arrive at a figure that would help you out considerably. It's not for sale, she said. We've been through this. Things change. Circumstances change. He said it gently, like he was being kind. Widow alone on 360 acres. Roof damaged. Expenses adding up. There's no shame in making a practical decision, Eliza. The thing about Bram Vickery was that he said things like there's no shame in a tone that implied the opposite. Like a man who puts his foot on the back of your neck and tells you there's no shame in lying down. She kept her expression still. The eastern pasture isn't for sale. The ranch isn't for sale. Nothing on this property is for sale. Vickery nodded slowly, like a man patiently giving her time to arrive at a different conclusion. All right, but think about it. He glanced up at the roof and something shifted in his expression just for a half second. Not anger, more like a recalculation. He'd send Silas on the roof. New man working up there, he asked. My carpenter, she said. Another nod, another smile that didn't reach his eyes. Well, you know where to find me if your thinking changes. He rode away with his 2 men, and Eliza stood in her doorway watching him go, and she knew the way you know certain things in your gut before your mind has fully assembled the evidence that this was not the end of it. Silas had seen the exchange from the roof. He said nothing about it when she brought him coffee that afternoon, but she noticed that he'd been watching the lane for a while after Vickery's horses disappeared. You know him? She asked, because she wasn't a woman who did well with subtext she could address directly. Silas was quiet for a moment. I know his type, he said finally. He wants the eastern pasture. He's been after it for 2 years. I keep saying no. The eastern pasture's got creekacus, Silas said. Question. Yes, he nodded once slowly. That's the thing he wants. Not the land, Eliza looked at him. I know, she said. My husband filed water rights on that creek 12 years ago. It's documented. Silas didn't say anything else. He finished his coffee, handed back the cup, and went back to work. But she noticed that something had shifted slightly in his expression, not alarm, not concern exactly. More like the look of a man who had just added a piece of information to something he was already thinking about. She went back inside and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, watching him work, and thought, what does Bram Vickery do when someone keeps saying no? She had a feeling she was about to find out. 3 days later, she found out. It came through the land office, not officially, not a legal document, but a rumor, the kind that travels faster than any letter in a small territory. Someone had mentioned casually, over a drink, the way Vickery's information always seemed to travel, that there might be an irregularity in Thomas Renford's water filing from 12 years ago. Not a certainty, just a possibility, the kind of thing that could be looked into. The kind of thing that could take years and money to resolve if it went to a territorial court. Eliza heard about it from the feed store man, who heard it from a rancher named Colt Dewey, who had it from someone he couldn't quite remember. That was how these things worked. Nobody was officially saying anything. But everybody was talking. She drove the wagon back from town, gripping the reins tighter than she needed to, and by the time she got back to the ranch, her jaw was aching from clenching it. Silas was working on the barn by then. He'd found additional damage when he looked more carefully, a joint that had been compromised for longer than anyone had noticed, and he looked up when she came in. He could read something in the way she moved. She could tell because he set down his tools. What happened? He asked. She told him, concisely, because she was in no mood to elaborate. The rumor about the water filing, the way it had come through back channels. The way it was designed to plant doubt without being something she could directly contest. Silas was quiet for a moment that went on long enough that she wondered if he was going to respond at all. He doesn't need the rumor to be true, Silas finally said. He just needs you to spend money and time finding out it isn't. Eliza looked at him. That's what I figured. You've got the original filing documentation? In the house. Thomas kept everything. Good. Silas picked up his tools again, turned back to the joint he'd been working on, and then paused. I know a man, territorial attorney out of Millhaven. He's worked water law cases out here for 20 years. If I write to him and tell him the situation, he'll tell us whether there's anything to worry about. She noticed us. She didn't remark on it, but she noticed it. That would help, she said, and was surprised to find that her jaw had unclenched slightly. He wrote the letter that evening, sitting at her kitchen table with paper she provided, with a handwriting that was careful and clear, and said nothing extra. He sealed it, told her he'd send it from town in the morning, and then sat back and looked at her for a moment. You're not going to sell, he said. It wasn't a question. No, she said. He nodded once. Then we figure it out, he said. And for the first time since the morning, Bram Vickery had walked into her kitchen with mud on his boots and a document on her table. For the first time in longer than that, if she was being honest, Eliza Renford felt something she had almost forgotten the texture of. She felt like she wasn't entirely alone. She set her coffee cup down and looked out the window at the lane where Vickery's horses had been, and she thought, come on then. See what happens. The letter went out on a Tuesday. Silas rode to town himself to send it, which Eliza noted but didn't comment on. He could have given it to the feed store man or the mail rider who came through on Mondays, but instead he saddled Temperance at first light and made the 12-mile round trip before she'd finished her morning chores. When he came back, he said only that it was sent, and then he went back to work on the barn joint like the morning had been entirely ordinary. She didn't ask how long the reply might take. She knew he didn't know. Millhaven was 3 days by post on a good week, longer if the roads were bad, and March roads in Montana were rarely good. They were in the waiting period now, and waiting was something Eliza had become grimly proficient at over the past 14 months. You waited for weather to break. You waited for prices to improve. You waited for the next problem to reveal itself so you could figure out how to handle it. What she hadn't been good at in a long time was waiting alongside someone else. It changed the texture of it, she discovered, not dramatically. Not in any way she could have articulated if someone had asked her to explain it. But there was a difference between lying awake at night, running through your finances in your head while the wind pushed at the windows, and lying awake at night, knowing that tomorrow morning a man was going to show up and work on your barn and your house with the same steady focus he'd brought every day for the past week. It wasn't that Silas fixed anything about the fear. He just made the silence around it feel less absolute. She didn't examine this feeling too closely. She was a practical woman, and examining feelings that didn't have an immediate practical application had never been her strong suit. Thomas had always said she approached her own emotions the way she approached a fence line, checking for weak spots, reinforcing where needed, moving on. Thomas had not always meant it as a compliment. She missed him in the mornings mostly. That was when she'd learned she grieved not in dramatic waves, the way people described grief, but in small, specific moments. The second cup of coffee she made out of habit and then stood looking at. The side of the bed that still felt wrong to sleep on even after 14 months. The way she'd catch herself turning to say something and finding only air. She didn't say any of this to Silas, but she thought about it that week, more than she had in a while. Maybe because having someone else present on the property, someone moving around outside her windows, working in her barn, drinking coffee at her back step, made the contrast sharper. The house felt less empty, and feeling less empty made her more aware of how empty it had been. This was not a comfortable realization. She set it aside and went back to work. The days had a rhythm now that they hadn't had before Silas arrived. He came at first light, worked through the morning on the roof. Framing the ridge beam replacement was a slow, precise job that could not be rushed without risking the integrity of everything attached to it, and then move to whatever secondary task needed attention while adhesive cured or lumber settled. He was quiet while he worked, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way of a man who had long since stopped needing noise to fill space. Eliza brought coffee mid-morning and again in the afternoon. This had started as practical courtesy and had become, without anyone deciding it, something slightly different. A pause in the day. A few minutes where they stood near each other and exchanged words that were sometimes about the work and sometimes about other things. She learned, in pieces, things about him, not because he volunteered much, but because she asked direct questions, and he answered them with the same directness she tried to bring to everything. He had come to Montana 18 years ago from Illinois. He had a sister in Bozeman he saw twice a year. He had learned carpentry from his father, who had been precise and demanding and occasionally impossible to please, and he had arrived at adulthood both grateful for the skill and privately determined not to pass on the demanding and impossible parts. He had never married, a fact he stated without the apologetic coloring men sometimes put around that particular admission. And when she asked why, which was perhaps a more direct question than was strictly polite, he thought about it for a moment before saying simply that he had never met anyone who seemed to want the kind of life he actually had to offer. He said it without self-pity. That was the thing. He said it the same way. He said the ridge beam needed replacing as an accurate assessment of a situation, nothing more. What kind of life is that, she asked. A quiet one, he said. Lots of moving. Different job, different town. Not much settled about it. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Most women I've known wanted settled. Most women I've known wanted settled because nobody gave them a choice about the alternative, she said, and then surprised herself slightly, because that had come out sharper than she'd intended. Silas looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. That might be right, he said. Then Temperance, who was tethered near the water trough, made a noise that sounded like commentary, and they both looked over at the horse, and the sharpness of the moment dissolved into something more ordinary. Temperance had, from approximately the second day, decided that Eliza was acceptable. This was notable because the horse was, by Silas's own admission, not particularly democratic in her opinions about people. She tolerated Silas with the comfortable condescension of an animal who has decided that someone is necessary rather than enjoyable. With Eliza, she was different. She'd push her nose into Eliza's shoulder when she came near, stand very still while Eliza checked her water, watch her with an attentiveness that the horse did not extend to anyone else on the property. She likes you, Silas had said. The third morning, watching this happen with an expression Eliza's couldn't fully interpret. Animals usually do, she said matter-of-factly. Thomas said I smelled like hay and competence. Silas had not said anything to that, but something in his face had done something briefly a shift, quickly controlled, like a man who thought of a response and decided against it. She had filed this away without knowing precisely why. On the 8th day, the fence line on the south pasture broke. Not the whole fence, a section, maybe 40 feet, where a winter-killed tree had finally come down and taken the wire and posts with it. Eliza found it in the morning when she did her perimeter check, which she did every 3 days regardless of weather or workload, because a fence down was an invitation to cattle wandering, and cattle wandering meant either loss or a conversation with a neighbor about whose animal was whose, and neither of those was a conversation she wanted. She was assessing it when she heard boots behind her. I can fix it, Silas said. She turned. He'd come across the pasture from the barn, apparently having seen her walking the line from a distance. He was looking at the downed tree, calculating. She could see him doing it the same way he'd looked at the roof that first day. You're not here to fix my fences, she said. I'm paying you for the roof. The fence will take me an hour, he said. Maybe less. That's not the point. He looked at her then, and there was a patience in it that she found, irrationally, slightly irritating. Mrs. Renford, he said, I've got adhesive curing inside that I can't touch for another 3 hours. I can stand in your barn and look at it, or I can fix your fence. Neither one costs you anything extra. She looked at him. He looked back. The morning was very still around them, the kind of still you got after cold weather when everything held its breath. The post setter's in the barn, she said finally. Second shelf on the left. He found it exactly where she said it would be, which she had expected. Silas Reddick was the kind of man who remembered where you kept things. She watched him work on the fence from a distance, not hovering. She was not a woman who hovered, but aware of him. He moved the fallen tree section first, which was heavier than it looked, and he knew it, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He took his time with the leverage rather than fighting it straight on. Set the new posts with the deliberate attention he gave to everything. Re-ran the wire without wasting it. She could have done it herself. She had done it herself plenty of times. But watching someone who knew what they were doing do a thing, well, there was something in that. She'd forgotten that there was something in that. By the time the adhesive was ready inside, the fence was whole. Vickery's name came back around on the 10th day through a different mouth. Her neighbor on the north side, a rancher named Hector Price, 50-ish, decent enough. One of the people in Copper Hollow who fell into the genuinely wanted to help category rode by to check on her after the storm damage. He was the kind of man who did that. He stayed for about 20 minutes and drank coffee at her kitchen table and made careful conversation, and then, as he was leaving, he stopped at the door. You hear anything about your water filing? He asked. She kept her voice even. I heard a rumor. More than a rumor now, Hector said carefully. Vickery's been talking to people at the land office, not filing anything official, just asking questions, letting people know he thinks there might be an issue. My husband filed those rights 12 years ago, she said. I have the documentation. I know you do. I'm not saying I believe him. Hector had the look of a man who wanted to be kind and also felt compelled to be accurate. I'm saying he's building something. You know how he works. It doesn't have to be real to cost you. I know how he works, she said. After Hector left, she stood in the kitchen for a moment and then went out to the barn where Silas was making adjustments to the interior barn structure. More damage that hadn't been immediately visible, which seemed to be a theme. Vickery's talking to people at the land office, she said without preamble. Silas was on a ladder, and he came down it with the unhurried care of a man who had been on enough ladders to have a clear relationship with the concept of falling. He dusted his hands on his pants and looked at her. He's not filing anything, he asked. Not yet, just asking questions. Hector thinks he's building pressure. Silas nodded once. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of having nothing to say, but the quiet of a man deciding what to say out of several available options. Has the attorney written back? She asked. Not yet. Could be another 3 or 4 days. She stood there and let herself feel, for just a second, the full weight of it. The roof repairs, the fence, the cattle count still down. The expenses she'd been tallying and retallying, and now Bram Vickery, making careful moves at the land office, building a case that might or might not have any legal merit, but would absolutely have a financial cost if she had to fight it. She did not let herself feel it for long. Long was not an option she had. All right, she said. She said it to herself as much as to Silas. A thing she did sometimes, speaking the acknowledgement out loud, because doing so helped her move past it. Eliza, Silas said. She looked at him. He almost never used her first name. He's not going to stop, Silas said, not because of stubbornness. Because he's done the calculation. He thinks if he makes it cost enough, you'll decide selling is smarter than fighting. He paused. Is he right about that? The question landed harder than she expected, because it was honest and she appreciated honesty, and also because nobody, in 14 months, had asked her directly whether she had a limit. No, she said. Silas held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded and turned back to the ladder. She went back inside, and she made herself do the accounts again. And she came out in the same place she always came out, which was she could hold on if nothing catastrophic happened. And she made herself sit with that for a moment rather than running past it. I can hold on, not comfortable, not safe, but true, which was enough. The 12th day brought 2 things. A hard rain that delayed the exterior roof work, and a visitor who was not Vickery but was, in a way, worse. His name was Fletcher Dodd, and he was Vickery's ranch foreman. A fact that everyone in the territory understood meant he was Vickery's instrument, in the same way a hammer is a carpenter's instrument. He was 38, tall, with a quality of stillness that was not like Silas's stillness. Silas was still in the way of a man who had made peace with himself. Fletcher Dodd was still in the way of a man who was waiting. He came alone, which was intentional. 2 men would have been a statement. One man was just a visit. Eliza answered the door before he knocked and had the mild satisfaction of watching him recalibrate. Mrs. Renford, he said. Mr. Vickery asked me to come by. He's had a chance to look more carefully at some of the land office records, and he wanted you to know that the situation with your water filing looks more complicated than he originally thought. Did he? She said. Not a question. He genuinely hates for you to be in a difficult position, Dodd said with a straight face. He wanted to reiterate that his offer for the eastern pasture stands. He's even prepared to increase the figure. He named a number. It was a good number. That was the worst part. It was a number that knew exactly how much trouble she was in. Tell Mr. Vickery I appreciate his concern, she said, and that my answer is still no. Dodd nodded slowly, the way men do when they've been told to nod slowly. He'll be disappointed to hear that. I imagine he will be, she said. She held the door until Dodd had gotten back on his horse and started down the lane, and then she closed it and stood with her back against it for a moment and breathed. Silas appeared from the hallway he'd been working inside because of the rain, insulating a section of the north wall. He'd clearly heard at least part of it. Dodd? He asked. You know him? Worked near one of Vickery's properties 2 years back. I know the man. She pushed off the door. He came with a higher number. Something moved across Silas's face, not surprise. More like confirmation of something he'd already suspected. He's escalating, yes, which means he's nervous. She looked at him. Why would he be nervous? He's the one with the money and the lawyers and the land office contacts. Because you haven't sold, Silas said simply. He expected you to fold by now. You haven't. That doesn't fit his model. He leaned against the wall frame, arms crossed, thinking. Men like Vickery, they're not patient in the way they look. They look patient because they're used to winning early. When it goes longer than they expected, they start spending more, moving faster. That's not confidence, that's anxiety. Eliza considered this. She had not thought about Vickery as anxious. She'd thought of him as an inevitable force, the way weather is an inevitable force. You think he's worried, she said. I think you've held longer than he planned for, and it's bothering him, Silas said. The higher number isn't generosity. It's a man revising upward because his first estimate was wrong. She stood there a moment and let this reframe something in her. Then she went to put on a second pot of coffee, because it was a two-pot kind of afternoon. The letter from the attorney arrived on the 14th day, and Silas brought it to her himself. He'd ridden to town for supplies that morning, she'd learned. He did this with the efficiency of someone who had always managed logistics alone, consolidating tasks so nothing was wasted, and when he came back he handed her an envelope with the return address of a firm in Millhaven. His name on the front, but he handed it directly to her. She opened it standing in the yard, with Temperance watching from the fence with the detached interest of a horse who understood more than she should. She read it once, then she read it again. Then she looked up at Silas. He says the filing is sound, she said. Thomas did it right. All the documentation, the dates, the claims, the signatures, everything is in proper order. She paused. He says Vickery's case, if he files one, has almost no chance of succeeding. Silas nodded. He'd known or suspected, which was nearly the same thing. He also says, she continued, her voice slightly different now, that if Vickery does try to file, having legal representation prepared in advance will significantly reduce the cost and time of defending it. He's willing to put himself on record as her attorney if needed. She folded the letter. For a moment, the only sound was Temperance shifting her weight and the wind moving through the trees on the far side of the fence. Eliza stood there in her yard with a piece of paper in her hands that said, in plain attorney's language, that Bram Vickery had been running a bluff. She had known it. Somewhere underneath the anxiety and the arithmetic and the sleepless tallying, she had believed it was a bluff. But believing something and having an attorney in Millhaven confirm it in writing were two very different things. She was surprised to find that her eyes were stinging slightly. She blinked it back. She was not going to stand in her own yard and cry over a letter, not even a good one. You all right? Silas asked quietly. Yes, she said. And then, because he had asked honestly and deserved an honest answer, better than I've been in about 3 weeks. He looked at her for a moment. Good, he said simply. No elaboration, no performance. Just good. The way he said everything like the word was accurate, and that was enough. She put the letter in the pocket of her work coat, close to her side. That evening was different. She made supper not the usual quick thing she made for herself alone, but an actual meal, the kind that took time. She did it without deliberating much about it. She did it the same way she'd started bringing the second cup of coffee, not because she'd decided to exactly, but because it was the right thing in the moment, and she had learned, slowly, to trust that. Silas came in from washing up at the pump and stopped when he saw the table. You didn't have to. He started. I know I didn't have to, she said. Sit down, he sat down. They ate together with the lamp lit against the early dark, and the house, which had felt so hollow in the months after Thomas died, felt like something other than hollow. Not what it had been. Something different. Something she didn't have a word for yet and wasn't going to look for one. They talked, genuinely talked, in the way they hadn't quite managed in 2 weeks of coffee on the back step. Told him about how she and Thomas had come out here, how it had been his idea first. The land, the cattle, the whole dream of a place that was theirs. And how she had been terrified and gone anyway, because she had never yet let fear make the decision for her, and she wasn't about to start then. She told him how the first winter had almost killed her faith in the whole thing, not because of the cold or the isolation, but because of the particular loneliness of watching someone else's dream and not yet knowing how to make it yours. When did it become yours? Silas asked. She thought about it. Second spring, she said. The cattle made it through the winter, and I was the one who got them through. Thomas was sick most of February. I did the checks, I did the feeding, I pulled 2 calves myself. And in March, when they were all still standing, she stopped. I don't know how to explain it except that something shifted. It wasn't his dream anymore. It was our land. Silas listened to this in the way he did everything completely, without interruption. You haven't thought about selling, he said. Not seriously. No, she said. Even before I got here, even when it was the logical thing. I've thought about it, she said. Late at night, when the arithmetic doesn't work out and I can't stop running it. I think, what would it be like to just let go? To go back east? Not to have to carry this. She paused. And then morning comes and I go out and I see the land and I know I can't. It's not stubbornness. It's I'm part of it now. The fence posts know my hands. The cattle know my voice. If I left, I don't know who I'd be. The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from somewhere. Neither of them moved to adjust it. I understand that, Silas said. And the way he said it, not I can imagine that, not that makes sense. But I understand told her that he actually did. She looked at him across the table, 55 years old, weathered in ways that had nothing to do with sun and wind. A man who had spent his life making other people's structures sound and moving on, never accumulating the kind of life that stayed put. She thought briefly about what that must be like, to be very good at building things that belong to other people. She didn't say this. It wasn't the right moment, but she thought it. 2 days later, Silas came to her with something that made the letter from the attorney feel like a preamble. He'd been quiet all morning, in a way that was different from his usual quiet, not peaceful, but deliberate. Like a man who had been turning something over and had arrived at a decision about it. She was in the kitchen going through the feed calculations when he came in and sat down at the table without being invited, which was notable because he never did that. Down her pencil. I want to ride to Vickery's, he said. She looked at him. Not to fight anything, he said. I want to talk to him. Tell him the filing is sound, that there's an attorney ready to defend it, and that the situation is no longer what he thinks it is. I can do that myself, she said. I know you can, he said. That's not why I want to go. She waited. If you go, it's a widow defending her property, Silas said. If I go, he stopped, seeming briefly uncomfortable with what he was about to say, which she found interesting, because he was not typically a man who got uncomfortable. He knows you're not standing alone anymore. That's a different conversation. Eliza sat with this for a moment. She had a complicated relationship with the idea of needing someone to stand beside her. It cut against everything she'd built in herself over the past 14 months. Every wall, every careful habit of self-sufficiency. And at the same time, she was a practical woman, and she knew what Silas was saying was true. Vickery had built his entire strategy on the image of a woman, alone on a piece of land she couldn't quite hold. Silas riding to his property to speak on her behalf was not her weakness. It was Vickery's strategy collapsing. It still cost her something to say it. All right, she said. Silas nodded once and stood up. Take the attorney's letter, she said. He paused, looked at her. I know what it says. I know you do, she said. Take it anyway. He held out his hand. She got up, went to the coat by the door, took the folded letter from the inside pocket and put it in his hand. Their fingers didn't quite touch. Almost. Be careful, she said, and meant it in more ways than she named. He rode out on Temperance in the early afternoon, and Eliza watched from the porch until the gray horse and the man on her disappeared around the bend in the lane. Then she went back inside and tried to do the feed calculations and couldn't concentrate on them and sat at the table instead with cold coffee and the particular feeling of a person who has put something important in someone else's hands. She had not done that in a long time. She discovered she had not quite forgotten how much it cost. But she had also forgotten, until now, how it was different from being alone. The way that handing someone something, really handing it, not just asking for help, but trusting them with the actual thing that mattered, was an action that changed you in the doing of it. That it required something from you, yes, but that the requiring of it was not the same as losing it. Outside, the wind had settled. The ranch was quiet. The new ridge beam was in place, strong and true, and the roof above her head was sound for the first time in weeks. She thought, whatever happens when he comes back, this place is still mine. And then, but I am glad he went. She let herself hold both of those things at once, which was new, and which was, if she was being exactly honest, not as hard as she had expected it to be. He was gone for 4 hours. Eliza knew the ride to Vickery's main ranch was about an hour and a half each way, which meant Silas had spent somewhere around an hour on the property itself. She didn't know if that was a good sign or a bad one. She told herself she wasn't tracking the time, and she was lying to herself, and she knew it. She managed to finish the feed calculations on the second attempt, got through her afternoon chores, checked the cattle, checked the new roof section from the yard the way she'd started doing, every day looking up at the ridgeline with the same assessing eye Silas had taught her without meaning to, and then came back inside and started on supper. Because supper needed to happen regardless of what was occurring 12 miles away on Bram Vickery's property. She heard Temperance on the lane at 5:15. She stayed in the kitchen. She was not going to walk out to the porch and stand there waiting like a woman, watching for news of a battle. She heard the horse stop, heard Silas dismount, heard the particular sound of him working the saddle loose the way he always did before anything else. Because Silas Reddick would tend to his horse before he tended to anything else in the world, and she had come to understand that this said something fundamental about the man. Then boots on the porch steps. He came in and stood in the kitchen doorway, and she looked at his face, and she couldn't read it. That was unusual. In 3 weeks, she had developed a reasonable understanding of his expressions, not because he was expressive in the ordinary sense, but because she'd been paying attention. And paying attention to a quiet person long enough eventually gives you a kind of fluency in the language they use instead of words. Right now his face was careful, not bad news careful. More like a man who had seen something he was still organizing. "Sit down," she said. "There's coffee." He sat, she poured. She put the cup in front of him and then sat down herself across the table. "Tell me," she said. He wrapped both hands around the cup, which she'd noticed he did when he was thinking. And he said, he backed down. She sat very still. "Not because he wanted to," Silas continued. "Not because he suddenly decided to be decent. I want to be clear about that. The man is going to be Bram Vickery until the day he dies, and that's not going to change." He paused. "But I showed him the attorney's letter, told him the filing was sound, told him the attorney was already retained and ready to defend it. And then I told him something else." She waited. "I told him you weren't alone anymore," Silas said. He said it evenly, but she noticed he didn't quite meet her eyes when he said it. He was looking at his coffee. "I told him there were people paying attention to how he was moving on this, and that any further pressure on you would find organized resistance instead of one woman on her own." "You said people," she said. "I said people. Is that true?" He looked up then. "Hector Price, the attorney." Me, a pause. "That's people." She absorbed this. How did he take it? "Quietly," Silas said, which is how men like him take things when they're recalculating. He didn't argue the filing. Couldn't the attorney's letter was clear enough that arguing it would have been embarrassing? He didn't admit the whole thing was a tactic. Men like him never admit that. He just shifted. Silas moved one hand slightly, a gesture she'd never seen him make before, like something sliding sideways. Said he'd have to look more carefully at his own records. Said perhaps there'd been a misunderstanding at the land office. Said he hoped there were no hard feelings. Eliza made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Yes," Silas said in the same tone. "He'll be back," she said. "Not right away, but eventually," Silas agreed. "But not on this. He's not going to contest the water filing. That avenue's closed. He picked up his coffee. He'll find another angle down the road. That's who he is. But it won't be this." She sat with that for a moment. The relief of it was real, and she let herself feel it, not dramatically. Just acknowledged it the way you acknowledge something that has been pressing on your chest, lifting slightly. She'd been carrying this particular weight for 3 weeks, and 3 weeks of something like that gets into your muscles without you noticing until it's gone. "Thank you," she said. Silas looked slightly uncomfortable, which she found unexpectedly endearing. He was not a man who knew what to do with gratitude. He accepted it the way he accepted compliments, with the mild awkwardness of someone who had not built a system for it. "You did the hard part," he said. "You held for 3 weeks when selling would have been easier. The hard part was yours today," she said. "I know what it costs, walking onto a man like Vickery's property and telling him something he doesn't want to hear." Silas didn't argue this. He drank his coffee. Outside, the last of the day's light was going down behind the ridge, and the kitchen was warm from the stove. And somewhere outside, Temperance made the small comfortable sound she made when she'd been fed and settled. "Stay for supper," Eliza said. It was the first time she'd asked directly rather than simply setting an extra plate. He looked up. Something moved across his face consideration, and something underneath the consideration that she couldn't name. "All right," he said. They ate later than usual, and the conversation over the table was different from previous evenings in a way that was hard to define but impossible to miss. Something had eased between them. Not the careful quality of it, they were both still careful people. People who had learned that saying the wrong thing cost more than saying nothing but the guardedness. The particular held-back quality of two people who aren't yet sure what the other one will do with information. Silas told her about Vickery's ranch, which she hadn't seen and wouldn't have been invited to see. The size of it, the main house, was something that aspired to grandeur and landed somewhere closer to excess, he said. In the flat way he described things that didn't impress him. The way the ranch hands moved around Vickery with the careful deference of people who knew which way the weather turned. The portrait of Vickery himself on the wall of the office where they'd talked, younger by 20 years, already wearing the expression of a man who expected the world to arrange itself around him. "He offered me work," Silas said. Carefully, she set down her fork. "When?" "After. When it was clear I wasn't going to back down and he'd decided to shift his position." Almost like it was an afterthought, except it wasn't. Silas looked at his plate. "He's got a bunkhouse that needs a new floor and a stable that needs structural repair. Good money, probably. He knew I was finishing up here." The kitchen was very quiet, and she asked. "And I told him I had a prior commitment," Silas said. She looked at him. "You told him what?" "I told him I had a prior commitment." He looked up. "I haven't finished here." She thought about this. The roof was mostly done. The barn work was done. The fence was repaired. He was down to detail work, the kind of finishing that a man like Silas could complete in 2 or 3 days if he chose to move at that pace. "You told him you were already committed," she said slowly. "I told him the truth," Silas said. "I don't leave jobs before they're done." This was, she knew, entirely accurate. It was also, she suspected, not the complete truth. But she did not push it. She was a woman who had learned to recognize the difference between a door that was closed and a door that was only not yet open, and she had learned that some doors required patience more than force. She picked up her fork again. "He'll take it personally," she said. "You turning down the work, probably," Silas said. "I can live with that." She smiled at her plate. She couldn't help it, and she didn't try to stop it, because it was a genuine smile, the kind that came from somewhere specific and unperformed, and she was 35 years old and had done enough pretending in the past 14 months to last her a considerable while. The roof was finished on the 19th day. The new ridge beam ran true and level across the full length of the house, set into the north and south walls with the precision that characterized everything Silas built. The shingles above it were new where they needed to be new, and properly seated where the originals had survived. The flashing around the chimney was reset and sealed. Every small defect he had found in the process of fixing the large ones had been corrected, not because Eliza had asked, but because he was constitutionally unable to leave a job with things in it that he knew were wrong. She stood in the yard and looked up at it, and she thought Thomas would have been happy with that. The thought arrived without the usual accompanying grief. Just Thomas would have been happy with that. A fact, clean and clear. She went inside and started making a list of what remained, because that was how she operated. She could not celebrate a finished thing until she had confirmed that it was actually finished, which meant going through it item by item. Ridge beam done, shingles done, barn joint done. South fence done, interior insulation on the north wall done. She looked at the list for a moment. Then she put the pencil down and acknowledged. quietly and to herself, that the man had done everything he'd said he would do, and more besides. What happened on the 21st night was something she hadn't planned. The day had been ordinary, the kind of late March day that reminded you winter was arguing with spring, and neither one had given up yet. Cold enough to need a coat, but bright enough that the cold felt temporary. Silas had been doing final detail work all day, the small, careful things, checking every nail head, testing every joint, going back over sections he'd already finished, because apparently finished was not the same as done in his understanding of things. Late afternoon, she'd suggested they sit on the fence for a bit. Not for any particular reason, she'd been inside most of the day working on the accounts, and the light was good, and she was tired of numbers. She'd said it without much ceremony, and he'd agreed with the same lack of ceremony. They sat on the repaired section of the south fence, the one he'd fixed when the tree came down, and the last of the light was doing what Montana light did, sometimes in March going gold and long across everything, making the ordinary landscape look like something a person might paint if they knew how. They sat there for a while without talking, which was not uncomfortable. They had gotten past the point where silence required filling. Then Eliza said something she hadn't planned to say. "I'm tired," she said it quietly, not as a complaint, just as a fact. But she heard something in her own voice when she said it that she hadn't meant to expose us, something underneath the word that was more than physical tired, and they both knew it. Silas didn't say anything immediately. He didn't say, "I know," or "of course you are," or any of the other things that would have been well-intentioned and would have landed wrong. He sat on the fence with his hands resting on his knees and looked at the long light going across her land. Then he said, "I know." 2 words, but the way he said them was the difference. Not sympathetic, not pitying. The sound of someone who actually understood what a person meant when they said a thing like that, because they had said it themselves, to themselves, in the dark of enough different towns and finished jobs and packed up lives. Something in Eliza's chest shifted. She had been carrying the weight of this land alone for 14 months. Before that, she had been carrying it alongside Thomas, which was different from carrying it alone, but which was also, she could admit this now, in the long, honest light of late afternoon, not always what it should have been. Thomas had been a good man, and she had loved him, and she did not want to diminish any of that. But he had been a man with a vision, and visions are not the same as partnerships. And there had been times when she had carried more of the practical weight than anyone looking in from outside would have seen. She had never said this to anyone. She said it now, haltingly, because the light was right, and the man beside her had just said "I know" in a way that meant she didn't have to explain herself. He was a good man, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not, she stopped, but this was his dream first. I came into it, and sometimes I think I stayed not just because I loved this place, but because leaving would have meant admitting that the dream cost more than either of us knew it was going to. Silas was quiet. That's not noble, she said. I know it's not noble. People think I'm staying because I'm brave or stubborn or some kind of... She made a sound that dismissed all of it. Mostly I'm staying because I don't know who I am if I'm not the woman who stayed. She hadn't known that was true until she said it. The silence afterward was the kind that holds something. That's honest, Silas said. You're not going to tell me that's enough? That staying for any reason is the brave thing? No, he said. I don't think you need me to. She looked at him, the side of his face, since they were both looking out at the land. The way the light hit the lines that the years had put in his face and made them look less like damage and more like something that had been earned honestly. What about you? She asked. Are you ever tired? He took a moment. She had noticed that he always took a moment before answering questions that actually mattered to him, not stalling, just making sure the thing he said was the thing he meant. Yes, he said, for a while I told myself I wasn't. That the moving around was a choice I was making freely. That I liked not having things to hold on to. He paused. That was easier than the alternative. What's the alternative? Admitting you're tired, he said, and then having to decide what to do about it. The light was almost gone now. The gold had flattened to gray, and the temperature was dropping, and somewhere in the barn, one of the horses made the small sound they made when they noticed the day ending. She didn't say anything else for a moment, and neither did he, and the weight of what had just been admitted sat between them like something that had been set down after a long carrying. She did not sleep well that night. This was not unusual. She'd been a poor sleeper since Thomas died. Her mind running through problems in the dark the way it used to run through them in his company. Out loud, which had been better. But that night, the problem her mind kept returning to was not the finances or the cattle or the fence on the north boundary that she knew was going to need attention by summer. It was Silas, not in the way she would have been embarrassed to admit to, exactly. Or not only in that way, it was more complicated than that, and she was honest enough with herself to sit with the complication rather than flatten it into something simpler. She had not expected to find a person like him. She had not been looking, that was the first thing, and it was genuinely true, not the protestation of a person who was looking, but wanted to be seen as not looking. She had been looking for a carpenter, and she had found one, and then she had also found, by accident, or by whatever sequence of events you called it when accident produced something you didn't know you were missing, a man who spoke her language. Not the words, the silences, the way of moving through a problem without catastrophizing, the capacity to be tired and keep going, the particular loneliness of being very good at something and having that goodness serve other people's lives consistently without accumulating anything of your own. She lay in the dark and thought about what he'd said, admitting you're tired, and then having to decide what to do about it. She had decided what to do about her own tiredness a long time ago, she realized. She'd decided to keep going. She'd decided that the land and the cattle and the work would be enough, and mostly she'd believed it, and mostly it had been. Mostly was doing a lot of work lately. She turned onto her back and stared at the ceiling, which was her own ceiling again, intact and sealed and no longer open to a Montana sky. And she thought about the man sleeping she assumed in the room she'd set up for him when it had become clear the job would take longer than a week and riding 12 miles twice a day was unnecessary. She thought about the way he'd said I noticed her almost immediately to no one, to Temperance. In a private moment she wasn't supposed to have heard 3 days ago when she came back to the barn for a tool she'd forgotten and stopped in the doorway because he was talking to the horse in the low, quiet voice men sometimes used with animals when they were actually working something out. She had backed away without making a sound. She had not told him she'd heard. She was still not sure what to do with having heard. The 22nd day. Silas came in that morning with a specific stillness that told her he'd made a decision overnight. She recognized this because she did the same thing, brought decisions to the morning instead of making them in the dark, because decisions made in daylight had a different quality. I think I'm done, he said. She set down her coffee cup. The house is sound, he said. The barn is sound. The fence is right. There's a section on the east side of the barn roof. I'm going to check this morning. I want to see it in good light. But if it's what I think, everything's done. She nodded. I'll finish this morning, he said, and then I'll pack up. She nodded again. She was not going to say anything she wasn't sure of. She had spent too long making herself not need people to start now with something unplanned and possibly regrettable and definitely complicated. I'll make sure you have the payment ready, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face was doing something she couldn't fully read and didn't want to get wrong. All right, he said. He went out. She sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee and the particular sensation of a person watching something end when they haven't entirely decided whether they want it to. The east side of the barn roof was fine, he told her at midday. He'd been thorough about it. She could see from the way he moved when he came back down that he'd been more thorough than strictly necessary, and she understood this without needing it explained. A man who knows a job is done can find reasons to keep checking if he needs time that he doesn't quite know how to ask for. She paid him after lunch. She'd prepared the envelope that morning, the full amount plus the extra for the beam replacement that he'd quoted her, honestly. She handed it to him at the back door, and he took it the way. He always took things she offered him directly, without the performance of reluctance that some men put on when taking money from a woman, as if the performance made them seem less like they were taking it. He just took it. That was one of the things about him she had noted early and not forgotten. He didn't count it. She'd expected that. Everything's in order, she said. I checked it twice. I trust your arithmetic, he said. He went to gather his tools. She watched him pack from the kitchen window, because she wasn't going to stand in the yard and watch him pack that was worse, somehow more exposed. From the window she could observe without being observed, and this was perhaps not her finest quality, but it was a quality she owned. He rolled his tools in their leather cases with the same systematic care he brought to everything. Loaded them onto the mule, checked the load, checked it again. Then went to Temperance and began to saddle her with the slow, unhurried movements of a man who was not trying to leave quickly. Eliza stood at the window and made herself be still. He led both animals out of the yard and toward the lane, and then stopped, turned, and looked at the house. Not at her, he didn't know she was watching. He looked at the house the way he'd looked at it the first day, with that assessing expression. But the assessing was different now. She could see it from the window across the yard. He wasn't looking for damage, he was looking at what was whole. Then he put his boot in the stirrup, and Eliza walked out of the kitchen. Didn't plan it. She had been very deliberately not planning things for the past several days as a strategy for avoiding disaster. And here she was anyway, walking through her own house and out the front door and across the porch and into the yard. Silas, she said. He turned. His boot was still in the stirrup. She crossed the yard and stopped a reasonable distance from him and Temperance looked at her with the horse's customary expression of knowing more than was appropriate. She looked at him, 55 years old, a man who had built and mended and repaired and moved on his entire adult life. A man who believed, with the quiet conviction of someone who had never had reason to question it, that certain things had belonged to an earlier chapter that was now finished, and that accepting this was not failure, but simple accuracy. She looked at him, and she thought, "You are so wrong about yourself, and you know it, and you won't say it, and so I will have to. Sometimes I wish I were 20 years older," she said. He went absolutely still, boot in the stirrup, hand on the saddle, head turned toward her. Every part of him arrested. "Maybe then you'd finally admit you've noticed me," she said. The words sat in the Montana air between them. Temperance shifted her weight and didn't go anywhere, because Temperance was a horse with sense. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he took his boot out of the stirrup, slowly, and he turned to face her, both feet on the ground, and he looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before, not the assessing look, not the careful look, not the quiet competence look she'd catalogued over 3 weeks. Something rawer than any of those, something that belonged to a man who had been found out. "I noticed you," he said, before the end of the first day. The words came quietly, but she heard them the way you hear a thing that changes the acoustic of a room. "Then what?" she said. "Have you been doing?" He looked away briefly, looked back. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "Telling myself it wasn't my place," he said. He stopped. "That you had enough to carry without me adding to it. Did it occur to you?" She said, very carefully, "to ask me what I could carry." He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he admitted. "Didn't. You measure everything else," she said. "You measured that beam. You measured the fence posts. You measured the barn joints to make sure they'd hold." She held his gaze. "Did you ever think about measuring this, Eliza?" "Don't tell me it's complicated," she said. "I've been doing complicated alone for 14 months. I know what complicated is." He looked at her, and she looked back, and the space between them was approximately 10 feet and felt like considerably more. "You deserve someone who isn't 55 years old and living out of saddlebags," he said. He said it like it was the conclusion of an argument he'd been making for weeks. "You deserve to stop deciding what other people deserve," she said. The words landed. She could see them land in the way his face changed. Some held thing giving way to something else underneath. Something she recognized because she'd felt it herself earlier, sitting on the fence at sunset, saying, "I'm tired," into the last of the light. He had built things his entire life. Good things, true things, things that held weight and kept families dry through winter and stood long after he was gone. And somewhere in all that building he had accepted, without ever saying it plainly, that the one thing he would not build was a life that included him, that his skill was something he gave away. job by job, town by town, and that this was simply the arrangement. She could see him seeing it for the first time in the way she was looking at him. Silas, she said, and her voice was quieter now. Not soft, she was not a soft person, but human. You fixed everything on this property that was broken. Everything. The things I asked you to fix and the things I didn't. She paused. When are you going to let somebody fix the one thing that's broken in you? The silence was very long. I don't know that it can be fixed, he said finally. And for the first time, she heard something in his voice that was not steadiness or competence or careful restraint. Something that sounded like a man admitting a fear out loud to another person, which she suspected he had not done in a very long time. Neither do I, she said honestly, but I'd like to find out. He stood there in her yard, Temperance patient beside him. The late afternoon turning the air gold again, the way it had on the fence 2 nights ago, and he looked at Eliza Renford, who had survived 2 brutal winters alone and driven off a land baron, and told him, directly and without apology, that she had noticed him noticing her, and something in his chest that had been sitting in a particular held position for a very long time began very carefully to shift. He wasn't ready to call it hope. He had been practical too long to reach for that word easily. But it was something, and it was pointed in a direction he had not pointed in a very long time. He stood in her yard with both feet on the ground, and he did not yet say the thing that needed saying, but he did not walk away either. And she watched him with the patience of a woman who had learned to be patient with the land and had discovered that the same skill applied, more than she'd expected, to people. The ranch was quiet around them. The repaired roof held the last of the light, and Eliza waited. He stood there long enough that the cold started coming up from the ground. Eliza didn't move. She had said what she'd said, and she was not going to take it back, and she was not going to soften it. And if he needed time to stand in her yard with both feet on the ground and work through whatever he was working through, then she would wait. She had waited out 2 Montana winters. She could wait out one man's reckoning with himself. Temperance made a small sound, low and particular, the kind she made when she was paying attention to something the humans around her hadn't sorted out yet. Silas looked at the horse briefly. Something crossed his face that might, on another man, have been embarrassment. Then he looked back at Eliza. "May I come back Sunday?" he said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. Something balanced in between, the way he balanced most things. Not to fix anything, not to check on the work. He paused. "Because I'd like to see you." She looked at him. "For supper," he added, as if the specificity made it more manageable. Eliza considered telling him that the question didn't require qualifications, that she understood perfectly well what he was asking and why, and that he didn't need to make it smaller than it was in order to ask it. She considered saying several things, actually, because she was not a woman who ran short of words when words were called for. But she looked at him standing in the cold yard, boot no longer in the stirrup, hands at his sides, having just asked a question that she understood cost him something he wasn't used to spending, and she said the only thing that actually needed saying. "Yes," she said. Silas nodded once. He turned back to Temperance, checked the saddle with one hand the way he always did, and mounted with the unhurried motion of a man who had been getting on horses for decades. He gathered the mule's lead rope. He looked at her from the saddle for a moment. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she confirmed. He rode down the lane, and this time Eliza did go to the porch. She stood on her own porch in the cold air and watched the gray horse and the man on her move down the lane and around the bend, and she stayed until there was nothing left to see, and then she stayed a moment longer for reasons she did not examine. Then she went inside, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she put her hands flat on the table and breathed in and out once, deliberately, the way she did when she needed to establish that something was real and not something she had imagined. Real, she confirmed. She got up and started on supper for one, which felt different now than it had for the past 14 months. Not better or worse different. The kind of different that meant something had changed shape, and you were still in the process of understanding what the new shape was. Saturday was an exercise in routine executed slightly imperfectly. She did her chores. She checked the cattle. She inspected the roof again from the yard it was holding perfectly, the new ridgeline clean against a gray sky, and found nothing to report. She rode the fence line on the north side, which she'd been meaning to do for a week, and found one loose post that she seated herself with a mallet and 2 minutes of work. Ordinary. Everything ordinary. Except that she cleaned the kitchen more thoroughly than the kitchen strictly required. Except that she went through her provisions and made a mental accounting of what she had and what she'd need to make a proper Sunday supper. Except that she caught herself twice in the early afternoon, standing still in the middle of some task, thinking about something other than the task, and had to specifically redirect herself. She was not a woman who mooned over things. She did not have the patience for it and never had. Thomas had once said she had the romantic sensibility of a good fence post, upright, functional, and unlikely to be moved by weather. She had taken this as a compliment. She still thought it was mostly accurate. But Sunday morning arrived, and she was up before first light, which was earlier than necessary, and she was at the stove making coffee in the dark when she acknowledged to herself that she was nervous. A simple, honest, slightly annoying fact. She was a 35-year-old widow who had survived considerably more than a Sunday supper, and she was nervous about a Sunday supper, and the only productive response to this was to make very good biscuits and stop examining herself. She made the biscuits. They were good. She made them again, because the first batch had been fine, but fine wasn't what she was going for today, and the second batch was better. At around 10 in the morning, when she was in the middle of deciding what to do with the hours between now and the afternoon, she heard a horse on the lane. She stopped. Too early for Silas, he'd said supper, which was an afternoon thing in this country, not a morning thing. She went to the window. It was Hector Price, her neighbor to the north, riding up alone with the easy pace of a man who had something to say but wasn't in a hurry about saying it. She opened the door before he dismounted. Morning, Hector. Morning, Eliza. He climbed down, tied his horse to the post with the familiar movement of a man who had been tying horses to posts all his life. You got a few minutes? I do. Come in. She poured coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, which was the standard arrangement for conversations in this part of the world. And Hector turned his cup in his hands and looked at her with the expression of a man choosing his words. You hear anything more from Vickery? He asked. Not directly, she said. Your man Reddick rode to his property a couple days back. Showed him the attorney's letter. Hector raised an eyebrow. The carpenter went to Vickery's? He did. Hector sat with this for a moment, absorbing what it implied. And Vickery shifted his position, said maybe there'd been a misunderstanding at the land office. Hector made a sound that was not charitable, but was accurate. A misunderstanding. He shook his head. That man. He drank his coffee. Well, I can tell you he hasn't been talking at the feed store this week. Whatever Reddick said to him, it quieted the noise. Good, Eliza said. There's something else, Hector said. He set down his cup. 2 days ago, Vickery made an offer on the Teller property, the 300 acres south of his east pasture. She looked at him. Teller is selling? Old Teller died in February. His son doesn't want the land. Vickery moved fast. Hector's voice was careful. That land doesn't give him creek access. Your creek's still yours. But it expands his grazing territory considerably to the south. He doesn't need your eastern pasture as badly now. The arithmetic of this landed slowly, and then all at once. He's replacing his strategy, she said. Expanding instead of pressuring, Hector said. He got what he needed a different way. She absorbed this. Part of her had understood, intellectually, what Silas had told her, that Vickery would find another angle eventually, that men like him always did, that the victory over the water filing was real but limited. Understanding it intellectually and sitting with the confirmation of it were different things. He'll leave my water alone, she said, but he's not going away. He's not going away, Hector agreed. He never goes away. But right now, today, he's pointed in a different direction. That buys you time to consolidate. He paused. Your cattle count, you're still down from the winter losses? 7 head, she said. I'm working on rebuilding. I've got 3 steers I'm looking to move before summer, Hector said, in the careful tone of a man making an offer without making it sound like charity. Fair price, good stock if you're interested. She looked at him. Hector Price was genuinely decent, and she had known this for 2 years, and she still had to manage her own resistance to being helped before she could accept help from genuinely decent people. This was one of her worst qualities, and she knew it. "I'm interested," she said. "Let me know your price, and I'll tell you if it works." Hector looked slightly relieved, as if he'd been prepared for more argument. "I'll send my boy over with the number tomorrow." After he left, she sat for a moment and thought about what he'd told her. Vickery moving on the Teller land, moving south instead of east. The pressure on her creek, access quietly dissolving, not because Vickery had experienced a change of conscience. She harbored no illusions about that, but because Reddick had closed one door and Vickery had gone, looking for another, and found one that cost him less. She should feel relieved. She did feel relieved. But she also knew that Vickery's pointed in a different direction right now was not the same as "Vickery has forgotten about you." And she filed this information in the part of her mind that tracked long-term threats and went back to her Sunday preparations. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon, which was precisely when a man would arrive if he'd thought about what time was appropriate and made a decision about it rather than just showing up. Temperance came up the lane with the gray horse's characteristic, unhurried authority, and Silas was wearing a shirt she hadn't seen before, not new, exactly, but cleaner than the work shirts they're kept. She noticed this from the window, and then specifically told herself to stop cataloging his clothing and went to the door. He'd brushed Temperance. The horse's coat had the particular sleekness of recent grooming, which Eliza suspected was Silas's equivalent of putting on a clean shirt, tending to the thing he loved best, before an occasion that mattered. "You're on time," she said from the door. "I said I would be," he said, dismounting. "I know. I'm just noting it." She stepped back to let him in. "There's coffee now, supper in about an hour." He came inside, and the house received him the way it had for 3 weeks, not quite the way it received a stranger. Because he had moved through it long enough that he knew where things were and how the floor creaked near the bedroom door and where the draft came in when the wind was from the north. But differently from before, too, he wasn't carrying tools. He wasn't calculating what needed fixing. He was just here. He sat at the kitchen table, which was now so thoroughly their arrangement that neither of them marked it, and she poured coffee and sat across from him, and the afternoon settled around them. "Hector came this morning," she said. She told him about Vickery and the Teller land. He listened with the full attention he gave to things that mattered, and at the end he nodded once in a way that said he'd already considered this possibility. "Come back around eventually," Silas said. "Not on the water. But something I know. You should get the attorney's name on a retainer arrangement. Nothing expensive, just a formal letter saying you've retained him for any water rights matters. Makes the cost of challenging you higher before he starts." She looked at him. "That's a good idea. I can write to him again if you want." He knows the situation. The offer was practical. It was also, she noted this, the offer of a man who was not, in fact, planning to pack up and move on in the way he'd been planning 3 days ago. Whether he'd admitted this to himself or not was a separate question. "I'll write to him myself," she said. "But thank you." He accepted this without argument, which was one of the things she appreciated about him. He made suggestions rather than decisions. And when she made a different decision, he didn't require explanation. "Hector also offered me 3 steers," she said. "Fair price. I'm going to take them." "Good. It gets me closer to where the herd count needs to be. I can rebuild from there." She paused. "I've been thinking about expanding the south pasture grazing area. The creek access gives me water rights out there that I haven't fully used. If I can get the herd count up by late summer, I could push farther east by next spring." Silas was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before, not frequently, but on specific occasions. It was the expression of a man who was paying close attention and finding it rewarding. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Go on, I'm done," she said. "That's the plan." "That's a good plan," he said. "And then, you don't stop thinking about it, do you?" "The ranch." "No," she said. "I think about it all the time. In the morning before I'm fully awake. At supper. When I can't sleep. Is that a problem?" She thought about it honestly. "Thomas thought it was," she said. "He thought I should be able to put it aside. Enjoy the evening without running the calculations." She turned her cup in her hands. "Couldn't. It's not anxiety exactly." It's more like I can't afford to not be thinking about it. Because if I stop, something happens that I didn't see coming. Silas nodded slowly. I'm the same way with jobs, he said. My sister tells me I'm not present when I'm working somewhere, that I'm thinking about the job even when I'm not at it. Does she think it's a problem? She thinks it's why I never settled, he said. She's probably not wrong. The kitchen was warm from the stove, the afternoon light going long through the west window. Outside, Temperance was in the paddock. Eliza had waved Silas toward it when he arrived, without discussing it, and he'd taken the horse in without comment, which felt like a small thing and wasn't. Your sister, Eliza said. You see her twice a year. Christmas and sometime in the summer. She has 3 children and a husband who runs a dry goods store, and she leads a completely different life than I do. He said this without complaint, just as a description of a fact. She worries about me. Do you let her? He looked up. What do you mean? Do you let her worry? Or do you tell her you're fine every time she asks? A pause. The second one, he said. Is that fair to her? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Probably not. People who care about you, Eliza said carefully, generally want accurate information. Not protection from information. He looked at her steadily. You're not only talking about my sister. No, she said. I'm not. He set down his coffee cup and was quiet for a moment that went a little longer than his usual pauses. She waited. I've been alone a long time, he said finally. Not I don't mean lonesome exactly, I mean functionally alone. Making decisions alone, managing alone, not having to explain anything to anyone or account for myself to anyone. He stopped. You get used to it in a way that's hard to describe. It becomes a wall, she said. He looked at her. A wall you built to keep the cold out, she said. And then it got so solid you forgot you built it, and you just think that's what you're like. He held her gaze for a long moment. Yes, he said. That's what it is. I know, she said. I built one too. The admission sat between them, honest and slightly uncomfortable, the way honest things sometimes were. Yours is newer, he said. 14 months is newer than 30 years, she agreed. Which means mine is probably easier to take down. Probably, he said. He looked at his hands. I don't know that I know how to do that. Neither do I, she said. But I suspect the answer isn't to stand in the yard and keep your boot in the stirrup indefinitely. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. He didn't smile easily, and she had stopped expecting him to. But it was something, and she had learned to value the something. No, he said. I suspect not. Supper was venison stew with the biscuits she'd made twice, and she did not tell him about the first batch. He ate with the appetite of a man who spent his days doing physical work, which she found uncomplicated and refreshing. Thomas had been a small eater, which had always meant leftovers she'd eaten alone. And she was a woman who cooked for a working appetite, and it was satisfying to cook for one again. They ate and they talked, and the talking was easier than any conversation they'd had over the 3 weeks of his work here, because the work was done and the position of things was different now. He was not her carpenter, sitting at her table as a courtesy between tasks. He was a man who had asked to see her, and she had said yes, and that changed the acoustics of everything. She told him things she hadn't planned to tell him. About her family back east, a mother who wrote letters full of concern and unspoken questions about when Eliza was going to come to her senses. 2 brothers who had never understood why she'd gone west in the first place, and understood even less why she was staying. About the particular quality of the loneliness after Thomas died, not the loud dramatic loneliness of missing someone, but the quiet structural loneliness of having been part of a 2-person system that had been running on one engine ever since, and how that was a different kind of tired than any she'd known before. He told her things, too, about the 18 years in Montana, the jobs that had stayed with him, and the ones he'd been glad to finish and leave. About the winter 3 years back when he'd been sick for 2 weeks in a rooming house in a town whose name he'd mostly forgotten, and how that had been the closest he'd come to examining what he was actually doing with his life, and how the examination had been uncomfortable enough that he'd gotten well and gone back to work and hadn't examined it again until very recently. Until this job, she said. Until this job, he confirmed. She refilled his coffee. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask me anything, he said. That seems to be established. When you rode to Vickery's, she said, You told him I wasn't standing alone. That there were people paying attention. Yes. Did you mean that just tactically? Or did you mean it? He looked at her steadily. Both, he said. It was tactically true. And it was actually true. Then you'd already decided, she said. Before I said anything in the yard. Before Sunday. You'd already decided you weren't just leaving. He was quiet for a moment. I'd decided something, he said carefully. I hadn't decided what to do about it. What were you afraid of, she asked, not accusatory, genuinely curious. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. She noticed he did this when something was difficult, a way of giving his hands something to do while his mind worked. That I didn't have enough left to offer, he said finally. That a man my age, living like I've lived, no property, no settled life, no certainties beyond what my hands can do, that walking into someone's life with all that missing was a different thing than being useful to her, and that those two things might look the same from a distance but weren't. You thought you'd be taking more than you gave, she said. Yes, she looked at him. Silas, do you understand that for 14 months I haven't had a single conversation that mattered? Not one conversation that was about anything real. People talk at me about the ranch and the weather and whether I'm managing and when I'm going to do the sensible thing. Nobody talks to me, she paused. You talk to me, you have since the second day. And you have no idea what that has been worth. He was looking at her very carefully. That's not nothing, she said. What you bring, don't you tell me it's nothing. I'm not saying it's nothing, he said. Then stop measuring what you have left against some idea of what you're supposed to have, she said. Because I'll tell you, I've watched you work for 3 weeks. I know what you're capable of. I know how you think. I know what you do when you find a problem, and what you do when someone gives you a hard answer, and what you do when you could take an easy job from a man like Vickery, and you choose not to. She held his gaze. Don't you tell me that's not enough? The lamp on the table was the only light in the kitchen now. The evening having come in fully around the house, and in the lamplight Silas Reddick looked like what he was. A man in his middle 50s, worn by decades of honest work, sitting at a table across from a woman who had just laid out a case that he was having genuine difficulty arguing against. You make it sound simple, he said. I make it sound honest, she said. Simple is a different thing. He picked up his coffee cup. Set it down, Eliza, he said, and then stopped. What? I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be clear about that from the start. I know how to work. I know how to be useful. I don't have much experience with. He gestured vaguely, which was the least specific gesture she'd ever seen him make. This being what, precisely? Staying, he said. And meaning it. The word landed. She had not expected that to be the word he landed on. She had expected something about commitment or relationship, or the various other words people reached for when they were trying to describe what they meant without quite saying it. But staying was the exact word, because it was the one that cost him the most to say, because it was the one thing he had never in 30 years allowed himself to fully mean. I know, she said, and then neither do I. Staying was Thomas's idea, and I made it mine, but I was always doing it in relation to something else. The land, the cattle, the work. She stopped. Found the word. I've never stayed for a person, just for a person. Without the work being the primary reason. That's what you're asking for, he said. Not a question. Checking. That's what I'm saying I'd like, she said. Yes, he was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she didn't try to fill it. Then I'd like to try, he said. I can't promise you I'll be good at it. I'm not asking for good at it, she said. I'm asking for honest about it. He nodded once, slowly, that I can do. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind was moving through the trees along the fence line, and the fire in the stove was making the particular sound it made when the wood had settled into a good steady burn. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of an ordinary evening in a house that was holding the weather out the way it was designed to do. There's pie, Eliza said. He looked at her. Is there? Apple from the last of the preserves. That, he said, is relevant information. She got up to get it, and she was almost at the counter when she stopped. She turned around. He was watching her, the way he watched things fully, without pretending he wasn't. Silas, she said. Yes, for what it's worth, she held his gaze. The first day. When you came up the lane and you were looking at the roof, the way you looked at it, she paused. I noticed you before you noticed me. Something moved across his face, not quite the rawness she'd seen in the yard. Something quieter than that, something that looked, more than anything else, like relief. Now she said, do you want pie or not? I want pie, he said. She turned back to the counter, and behind her she heard the very quiet sound of a man exhaling not dramatically, just breathing out, the way you do when something that has been tightly held is released, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing underneath, all the steadiness and competence and careful distance. Just a person. Just a tired, skilled, careful person who had gotten very good at not asking for things and was learning, slowly, that not asking was its own kind of cost. She cut the pie and brought it to the table, and they ate it in the lamplight without needing to fill the rest of the evening with anything more significant than that. And this, she thought, this ordinary lamplight pie-eating silence, this was what she had actually been missing for 14 months, and she was glad, finally, to be sitting in it. He left when the evening had gone fully dark, which was later than he'd arrived by several hours. He saddled Temperance in the paddock while Eliza held the lantern, which was not necessary, the moon was up, and he'd saddled that horse in complete darkness more times than either of them could count, but which she did anyway, because she wasn't ready to go back inside quite yet. Next Sunday, she said, as he checked the cinch. He paused. Is that an invitation, or are you telling me? Both, she said. He mounted. From the saddle, in the moonlight, he looked down at her with the same expression he'd had in the yard 3 days ago when she'd said, I wish I were 20 years older, that found out expression. That man who has had the thing he was hiding quietly named, and is against all expectation, relieved to have it named. Next Sunday, he said. He rode out, and she watched him go, and when the sound of Temperance's hooves had faded down the lane, she stood in the cold dark for a moment with the lantern, and looked up at the roof of her house. The ridgeline ran clean and true against the night sky. She thought about what it had taken to build that, the care, the patience, the refusal to leave anything wrong that could be made right. The way a man who builds things well builds them as if they're going to outlast him, because they probably will, and because the work deserves to be done correctly, regardless of who benefits from it eventually. She thought about how that quality, that particular insistence on doing the thing right, even when no one was watching, and no one would know, was also, if you paid attention, the quality she valued most in a person. She went inside. The kitchen was warm and the lamp was still lit, and the plates from supper were stacked by the basin, and the pie tin had 2 slices left in it, which she was already planning to have with her morning coffee. Ordinary. All of it ordinary, in the particular way that ordinary things felt different when the evening they ended had been what this one had been. She cleaned up, banked the stove, and went to bed. She slept through the night, for the first time, in longer than she could remember, without counting back to find the date, and when she woke in the morning to gray early light and the sound of the cattle moving in the near pasture, she lay still for a moment and noted this. Then she got up and made coffee. There was work to do, same as always. The north fence needed checking. She needed to write to the attorney about a retainer arrangement. She needed to talk to Hector's boy about those 3 steers. She needed to do the monthly accounts and check the hay supply and look at the east gate that had been sitting wrong on its hinge for 2 weeks and that she'd been ignoring in favor of more urgent things. She carried her coffee to the window and looked out at her land, in the early light the pastures, the barn with its repaired joints, the fence lines running true, the house roof above her head holding solid against whatever March intended to do next. Hers, still hers, more securely hers now than 3 weeks ago. She drank her coffee and made her list and thought about the week ahead. And somewhere in the thinking about the week ahead there was, without her specifically putting it there, Sunday. She didn't circle it or mark it or make much of it at all. She just knew it was there. That was enough. The letter to the attorney went out Monday morning. Eliza wrote it herself at the kitchen table in the early light before the day's work started. Clear letter, specific and unambiguous. The way she tried to write everything, she had no patience for letters that said 3 pages worth of nothing, and she suspected the attorney in Millhaven didn't either. She laid out the situation plainly. Vickery had backed down from the water filing challenge, had pivoted to acquiring the Teller land to the south, but remained a presence in the territory with both the means and the inclination to create future difficulties. She asked about a formal retainer arrangement for any water rights matters that might arise. She asked his fee for that arrangement. She sealed it and rode to town herself to send it, because Monday was a good mail day and she wanted it gone before she could second-guess the wording. While she was in town, she stopped at the feed store, where the man behind the counter around, perpetually good-natured fellow named August Helm, who had been running the store since before Eliza arrived in Copper Hollow, told her, without her asking, that Vickery's name hadn't come up in the store all week. Quiet as a Sunday morning, August said, clearly pleased about this. Let's hope it stays that way, she said. Word gets around, August said, in the tone of a man confirming something she already knew. People know Reddick rode out to his place. People know what for. He weighed her flour without looking up. People in this territory respect a man who doesn't make a lot of noise about the right thing. Just does it. Eliza paid for her provisions and didn't comment on this, but she carried it home with her in the way you carry information that confirms something you already believed and are glad to have confirmed. Tuesday, she rode out with Hector's boy, 17, serious-faced, the kind of young man who had learned to work before he'd learned to talk much, and looked at the 3 steers Hector was selling. They were good animals, solid through the shoulders, well-wintered, the kind of stock that came from a rancher who knew what he was doing and didn't cut corners on feed when the winter got hard. She negotiated the price down slightly, not because Hector's number was unfair, but because not negotiating, when negotiating was appropriate, was a different kind of unfair. And they settled on a figure that worked for both of them, without either party performing dissatisfaction about it. The steers came to her pasture on Wednesday afternoon, and she watched them settle into the herd with the satisfaction of a woman who was putting something back together that had been broken, piece by piece, at the pace the budget allowed. 7 head lost to the winter, 3 returned, 4 to go eventually. The mathematics of recovery were slow, but they were pointing in the right direction. Thursday, she fixed the east gate. She'd been putting it off for 2 weeks, and she put it off for 2 more hours Thursday morning by doing other things first. And then she made herself go out there with the tools and spend the 90 minutes it took to rehang it properly. This was a thing she'd noticed about herself. The jobs she dreaded took exactly as long as the jobs she didn't dread, and the dread itself was always worse than the job. Thomas used to say she manufactured obstacles. She thought the more accurate description was that she manufactured the anticipation of obstacles, which was different and in some ways worse. The gate hung right. She tested it 3 times. It swung clean. She went inside and crossed it off the list with perhaps more satisfaction than a gate hinge strictly warranted. Friday was accounts, which she did at the kitchen table with the same focused misery she brought to accounts every month. Numbers were not her enemy exactly, but they were not her friends, and the monthly reckoning of what had come in against what had gone out always left her with the slightly hollow feeling of a person who has survived something that could have gone differently. This month, the number was better than she'd expected. The roof repair had cost what Silas had said it would cost and not more. The attorney's fee had been reasonable, and the purchase of the 3 steers, while a real expense, had come in under what she'd budgeted for it. She ended the month with a margin she hadn't had in 3 months, thin but real. She sat back and looked at the numbers and thought, holding, still holding. Saturday she baked. She baked with the particular absence of self-examination that characterized her best baking, not thinking about what she was doing, just doing it. The way her hands knew the proportions without measuring, because she'd made these things enough times that her body had memorized them. Bread, because the bread was for the week and had nothing to do with Sunday. Pie, because the pie was for Sunday and she was not going to pretend otherwise even in the privacy of her own kitchen. She chose a different pie this time, peach preserves from the summer, the last of them, the one she'd been saving without being clear to herself about what she was saving them for until now. She made it in the afternoon, when the light through the west window was good, and when it came out of the oven and the kitchen smelled the way kitchens are supposed to smell, She stood at the counter for a moment and permitted herself to be simply present in her own life, rather than running the next calculation. It lasted about 40 seconds. Then she started thinking about the north fence again. She was, she thought, approximately who she had always been. Some things were changing, and some things were not, and that was probably accurate. Sunday came in clear and cold, the particular blue sky cold of late March that felt like the season was finally making a decision. He arrived at 2 again, which she was beginning to understand was simply when he arrived, he was a man of consistent habits, and Sunday at 2 was going to be Sunday at 2. And there was something about knowing this that she found more comforting than she would have predicted. Temperance came up the lane looking brushed again. Eliza had decided she was going to stop noticing this and keep noticing it anyway, because it was the detail that told you the thing the man wasn't saying. And she had found that the details people didn't think you'd notice were often the most accurate information available. He came in and hung his coat on the peg by the door, which he'd started doing on his first day of work and had never stopped, and sat at the table. And she poured coffee, and the whole thing had the comfortable quality of something that had been done before and was being done again, without either party needing to negotiate it. "How was your week?" he said. She told him. The attorney letter, the steers, the gate, the accounts. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without offering opinions on things she hadn't asked opinions about, just receiving the information as information. "The margin is thin," she said, about the accounts. "But it's there. Thin is enough," he said. "For now." "For now," he agreed. He turned his cup in his hands. "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. Something in his voice was different, not alarmed different, just careful in a way that was more deliberate than usual. "Ask," she said. "I've been talking to a man in town," Silas said. "A rancher named Del Coburn. He's got 200 acres northeast of here, runs cattle, and he's been having structural trouble with his main barn. Bad foundation work from when it was built. He wants it assessed and probably rebuilt." She waited. "It would be 3, maybe 4 weeks of work," Silas said. "Out of Copper Hollow, I could board at the rooming house in town." He paused. "I wanted to tell you before I said yes or no to him." She held his gaze. "Why? Because it's relevant to you," he said. "Where I am is relevant to you. I'm not going to make decisions about where I am without factoring that in." She sat with this for a moment. It was on the surface, a practical piece of information about a job. Underneath the surface, it was Silas Reddick telling her, as directly as he was capable of telling her anything, that he had updated his operating system, that the calculation of where to go and when had a new variable in it that he was not going to pretend wasn't there. "Del Coburn," she said. "I know him slightly. He's decent." "Seems to be. How's the pay?" Silas named a figure. It was fairer than fair, actually, which told her that Coburn either really needed the work done or had heard enough about Reddick's quality to understand what it was worth. "You should take it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You should take it," she repeated. "You're a carpenter. You have work. You should do your work." She paused. 3 or 4 weeks in town is not the other side of the territory. "No," he said, "it's not. And the rooming house is 12 miles from here," she said. "Which is the same 12 miles it was when you were working on this roof. You managed the ride then." The corner of his mouth moved. "I did. Then take the job, Silas," he nodded slowly. "I wanted to make sure," he stopped, "that I wasn't going to feel abandoned," she said. He looked at her. Yes. She thought about this honestly before she answered, because she owed him honesty, and she owed herself accuracy. Did she feel something when he said 4 weeks working elsewhere? Yes. Something small and reflexive, the thing that lived in her chest since Thomas died that went tight when something changed without warning. But that reflexive thing was not the whole truth of what she felt, and she was not going to let it speak for all of her. "I've been alone for 14 months, she said. "I know how to do alone. I don't love it, but I know how," she held his gaze. "What I don't want is for you to make yourself smaller than you are in order to be near me. That's not a trait I'm interested in." He was very quiet. "Take the Coburn job," she said. "Come on Sunday." "Every Sunday," he said. And there was something in the question, a directness he didn't usually allow himself, almost tentative, The way a man sounds when he's asking for something specific and is not used to asking for specific things. Every Sunday, she said. Yes. He nodded, picked up his coffee. Drank it, all right, he said. They sat in the kitchen in the Sunday afternoon quiet and drank their coffee, and Eliza thought about what she'd just done and found that she felt clear about it, which was how she felt about things when she'd made the right decision. Not excited, not relieved, just clear, like the sky on a morning when the weather has made up its mind. He started the Coburn job on Monday. The weeks that followed had a shape that neither of them had planned, and both of them, she suspected, had needed. The work week was hers, the ranch, the cattle, the accounts, the 100 daily decisions that no one else was going to make. Her life, unshared the way it had been, and Sunday was different. Sunday had become the thing in the week that the rest of the week was partly organized around, not in a way that made the rest of the week less real, but in the way that having a destination changes the texture of a road. He came every Sunday at 2. Sometimes he stayed for supper and left in the dark. Sometimes the evening ran long enough that she told him it was foolish to ride 12 miles in the cold and set up the spare room, which he used, without ceremony and left spotless, in the morning. These overnight Sundays accumulated without being counted, and she didn't count them, because counting felt like managing something that was working fine without management. They talked. This was the thing she hadn't anticipated about it, not the talking itself, because she'd known they could talk, but the range of it. The way a conversation could start somewhere practical and end somewhere entirely different without feeling like it had traveled. He told her about the Coburn barn work, the specifics of foundation repair, the decisions he made and why. She told him about the steers settling in, about a conversation she'd had with a cattle buyer from out of the territory who was interested in her stock by fall. They argued once mildly about the best approach to the east pasture expansion she was planning. He thought she was moving too fast. She thought he was being conservative. And they both made their cases and neither fully conceded, and they ate supper anyway, and the argument dissolved without a resolution, and that was fine. That was how actual arguments between actual people went, she had remembered. They didn't always resolve. Sometimes you just ate supper. She wrote to her mother in April, a real letter, longer than the dutiful updates she'd been sending for a year and a half. She told her about the roof damage and the repair and Vickery's maneuvering and the attorney and the steers. She told her about Silas, carefully in language that said what it needed to say without overstating where things were. Her mother wrote back faster than usual. Eliza suspected she'd been waiting for something like this letter for a year, and the return letter was more human than her mother usually managed in writing, less full of the subtext about coming home. "I'm glad you have someone paying attention," her mother wrote. "That's not nothing, Eliza. That's quite a lot, actually." She read this at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning and thought about it for a while. Then she wrote back and said, "I know. I'm beginning to understand that." The second week of April brought a complication that was neither catastrophic nor simple. Silas came on Sunday looking like a man who had been working through something all week, which she recognized because she'd watched him do it before the particular quality of stillness he had when something was sitting in him that hadn't been resolved. She put coffee in front of him and sat down and waited. "My sister wrote," he said. She waited. Her husband's dry goods store. He turned the cup. "He's had some financial trouble, the kind that's been building for a while and has gotten to the point where it can't be ignored." He paused. "She needs help. Not emergency help, but real help. Money and probably some time. She wants me to come to Bozeman." Eliza looked at him. "How long? She doesn't know. Couple of weeks to assess things. Possibly longer if the situation is as bad as she thinks." "Bozeman is a long way," she said. "Yes. When does she need you?" "She asked for as soon as I can come." He looked at her. "I'd need to finish the Coburn job first. Another week and a half. Then I could go." She thought about it. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about difficult things looking at it straight, not looking at it through what she wanted to be true. "Go," she said. He looked at her. "She's your sister," Eliza said. "She needs you. You should go." She paused. "Is this a question?" "No," he said slowly. "I'm going. You wanted to tell me in person," she said. "Yes," she nodded. How long do you think it actually takes? If you're being honest about it instead of optimistic. He considered. Month. Maybe 6 weeks if the situation is complicated. A month. 6 weeks. She sat with that and felt the thing in her chest do its reflexive tightening, and then she sat with that too and let it settle and looked at what was underneath it. That's not forever, she said. No, he said, it's not. Your sister needs you, she said, and you need to go. She looked at him steadily. I'll still be here, Silas. The ranch will still be here. The east fence will probably still need looking at. None of that is going anywhere. He was looking at her with the expression she'd come to think of as the honest one, not the careful one, not the competent one, but the one underneath those, the one that came out when he'd stopped managing what she saw. I don't want you to think he started. I don't, she said. I know why you're going, and I know you're coming back. You know I'm coming back, he said. Yes, she said simply. Do you? He held her gaze for a long moment. Yes, he said. I do. Then we're agreed, she said. Go take care of your sister. Write when you can. Come back when you're done. He looked at her for a moment longer and then nodded, the slow single nod that was his version of a settled thing. She cut the peach pie she'd made and put a slice in front of him and one in front of herself, and they ate it in the Sunday afternoon light. And she let herself feel the particular complicated texture of caring about someone who was going to leave, and knowing that leave was not the same as gone, and understanding, maybe for the first time since Thomas died, that the difference between those two things was everything. He left for Bozeman on the last day of April. He came by the ranch the morning he left, not Sunday, a Tuesday, because he was riding out from town and the ranch road was on the way. He did not stay long. Temperance was packed light the way she was when Silas was covering real distance, and he'd have to move through most of the day to make good miles. He stood in the yard and Eliza stood on the porch, and the morning was cold and clear. Right when you know the situation, she said. I will. Don't let your sister feed you terrible food without saying something. You'll just encourage it. He looked at her. My sister's a fine cook. I didn't say she wasn't. I said don't let her feed you bad food. She held his gaze. You'll know what I mean when you get there. The corner of his mouth moved. All right. She came down off the porch steps across the yard. She stopped in front of him, a reasonable distance, the way she always positioned herself close enough to be honest, far enough to be herself. Silas, she said. Yes, when you're in Bozeman, she said. When you're busy with your sister's situation and there's a lot to manage, and it's complicated, and it will be complicated. Family money always is I want you to remember something. What's that? That you have somewhere to come back to, she said. Not a job, not a thing to fix, somewhere, she paused. That's new for you. I know it's new, but I want you to know it's real while you're gone. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something he had not done before. He reached out and took her hand briefly, without ceremony, the way he did most things, and held it for a moment that was neither short nor long, but was exactly what it needed to be. I know, he said. I'll remember. He let go, turned to Temperance. Mounted. She stood in her yard in the cold April morning and watched him ride down the lane with the gray horse moving at the road pace. She now recognized not the barn pace, not the pasture pace, but the pace of a horse and rider who have a real distance ahead of them and have made their peace with it. The bend he stopped, turned once. She raised her hand. He raised his. Then he was around the bend and gone. And she stood there for a moment with the cold air on her face and the ranch quiet around her. And she thought, he's coming back. And then she thought, even if she said it out loud to the empty yard, it would still be true. She went inside and went to work. The weeks that followed were like most weeks on the ranch, full, in the way that work is full. Problem after problem solved or deferred. The cattle adjusting to the new steers. The pasture expansion taking its first real shape as she began clearing the east section she'd been planning since before Silas left. Physical work, the kind that used the body completely and quieted the mind's tendency to run ahead of itself. He wrote on the 8th day, a single page, economical as he was with everything. The situation is as complicated as she feared. The store has real debt, and her husband is not, I'll say honestly, a man who has been managing it well. He means well. He is not good at the thing he's been trying to do for 12 years. I don't say that harshly. Some people are not good at the thing they've committed to, and recognizing this is not a character flaw, just an accurate assessment that is painful to arrive at. Margaret is holding up. She is stronger than she gives herself credit for. I have told her this. She told me I was wrong. We are both probably right. The situation will take longer than a month. I want to be honest about that. Maybe 6 weeks, maybe 8. I will not know until I know. I think about the ranch. I think about the east pasture expansion you mentioned. I think you are right to move on it now, before summer makes the ground work harder. I think about other things, too. You know what they are. She read the letter twice. Then she got out paper and wrote back. The steers have settled in, and the herd count is looking better than it has since November. The east pasture clearing is going well. You were right, that it would be better to start from the north corner and work south, though I wasn't going to say so until I'd confirmed it myself. The gate is still hanging right. The roof is still sound. Tell your sister she is not wrong to recognize what isn't working. That takes more courage than people give it credit for. Fixing the thing is hard. Seeing clearly that it needs to be fixed is the step that comes before, and most people spend years avoiding it. I think about you too. You know what I mean. The peach preserves are gone. I am already thinking about this summer's peaches. She folded it and sent it and went back to work. The letters went back and forth every 10 days or so, and each one was more itself than the last, less careful, more direct. The way correspondence between two people gets when they've stopped performing for each other. He told her about his brother-in-law, who was, in fact, a decent man who had simply been in over his head for years and was experiencing the relief of finally putting it down. About his sister's children, who were loud and numerous and had apparently decided their uncle was primarily a climbing structure. About the particular exhaustion of being needed by family in the specific way that only family can need you, which was different from being needed professionally and cost more in ways that were harder to account for. She told him about the ranch, about a conversation she'd had with Hector, in which he'd mentioned carefully that word around Copper Hollow was shifting, that Eliza Renford was being talked about so differently than she'd been talked about a year ago. Not as the widow who hadn't sold yet, but as a rancher. A real one. The distinction was subtle and significant. She told him this without embarrassment, because she'd earned it and she knew it, and she was done pretending that earned things shouldn't be claimed. She told him about a morning when she'd stood on the south pasture in early May light and looked out at her land and felt, for the first time since Thomas died, that it was completely and unreservedly hers. Not hers in default, not hers because she'd refused to give it up, not hers as the last remaining piece of Thomas's vision. Hers because she had bled for it and worked it and defended it and made it into the thing it was, and it knew her hands and she knew its fences, and that was what ownership actually meant when it was real. She told him this in a letter and then looked at what she'd written and left it in because it was true and he would understand it. He wrote back, "That's what I hoped you'd find. I'm glad you found it. And then I'm coming back at the end of May. The situation here is as resolved as it's going to be for now. Margaret's husband is closing the store. It's the right decision, hard as it is. He has a possibility of work with a freight company that suits him better. Margaret will be all right. She is, as I said, stronger than she gives herself credit for. I'll be there the first Sunday of June." She folded the letter and set it on the table and sat with it for a moment. Then she went to check on the east pasture because the clearing work was at the stage where it needed daily attention, and the ranch did not pause for personal news. But she was smiling while she checked it. The first Sunday of June arrived warm and green, the kind of early summer day that Montana produced, when it was in a generous mood, the light coming down through air that still had some spring in it, the grass in the pastures, the particular green of a season that had finally committed. She was checking the east fence line when she heard Temperance on the lane. She didn't go to the house. She walked in from the east pasture, through the gap in the fence where the new gate would eventually go, across the yard, and he was just dismounting when she came around the side of the barn. He looked the same. That was her first thought, and also immediately afterward she recognized it as wrong. He didn't look the same. He looked like a man who had spent 6 weeks with family and had remembered what family cost and also what it was worth. He looked like a man who had been somewhere and was now back somewhere, and both of those things were visible in him in a way that had nothing to do with the surface. Temperance saw her and made the sound the pushing with the nose sound, the sound that meant she'd been noticed. "You're later than 2, Eliza said. "Long ride," he said. "Sorry, I wasn't complaining," she said. "I was noting it." He tied Temperance and turned to face her, and they stood in the June afternoon and looked at each other for a moment with the straightforward assessment of two people who have been apart long enough to need to confirm that the other one is still real. "How is she?" Eliza asked. "Your sister." "Better than she expected to be," he said. "The store closing was hard, but she can see forward now. She couldn't before." "Good. The children are unreasonable and wonderful," he said. "I had forgotten how small children are," she smiled. "Was that terrible?" "Parts of it," he said honestly. "I'm not built for chaos, but I'm glad I went." "I know," she said. "Could tell from your letters." He looked at her. "Could you?" "Yes. They changed. You stopped choosing words so carefully halfway through. You started just saying things." He considered this. "That might be accurate." "It is accurate," she said. "Come inside. There's coffee and I made a real supper. Not the throw-together kind." "What kind of supper?" he asked, and the question was so ordinary and so unguarded that she almost said something about it and then decided not to, because some things didn't need to be named to be real. "Roast and potatoes," she said, "and there's pie." "What kind of pie?" "Peach," she said, "first of the season. I put up the preserves early this year." He was quiet for a moment. She had told him in a letter about the peach preserves, about putting up the first of the season with him in mind, and she had written it and sent it before. She'd thought too carefully about what she was admitting, which she suspected was the point. He had not replied to that specific part of the letter, which she had also noticed. Now he said, "You put them up early." "I did," she said. "For Sunday." "For Sunday," she confirmed. He looked at her with the honest expression, the one underneath all the others. "I missed this," he said. "I want you to know that. I missed this specifically." "This being what?" she said, as she had said to him once before in a different context. "The lane coming up to your house," he said. "The way the yard looks from the lane. Knowing you were in it." He paused. "I wasn't missing an abstraction. I was missing this." She held his gaze. "Good," she said. "I was missing it too." They stood there in the June afternoon for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for two people standing in a yard, and then she turned and went to the house, and he followed. And inside the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was lit against the long evening, and the supper was in the oven, and the table was set for two the way she'd set it every Sunday for 6 weeks while he was gone, and set it now without thinking about it. He hung his coat on the peg, sat at the table. She poured coffee. Ordinary, all of it ordinary, and she had learned, was still learning, that ordinary with the right person was not a lesser thing, was not a compromise or a consolation, was in fact the whole of it. The summer moved the way Montana summers did when they were good, fast, bright, working weather from first light to last, the days long enough that you could almost believe they'd stay that way. Silas took a job in late June on a property 8 miles north of Copper Hollow, a rancher named Strand who needed a new bunkhouse framed before fall. Good work, fair pay, close enough that Sunday required no particular logistics. He boarded in town during the week, and on Sundays he came to the ranch at 2, and this was their arrangement, and it worked because they had both, separately and together, arrived at the understanding that an arrangement doesn't need to be elaborate to be real. Some Sundays they talked for hours. Some Sundays they were quiet for long stretches, companionable quiet, the kind that doesn't feel like absence but presence. He helped her occasionally with things on the ranch, not because she asked, and not because he couldn't stop himself from fixing things, but because he was there and the thing needed doing, and they were past the point of negotiating whose responsibility it was. She brought him coffee on the Strand property twice when she was in that direction anyway, and he accepted it the way he accepted everything she offered, directly and without performance. In July, Hector Price's wife came by for the first time, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Clara, who had known Eliza since her arrival in Copper Hollow, and had always been decent to her without ever quite crossing into friendship. Clara came for coffee on a Tuesday morning and drank it and talked about practical things for a while, and then said, without preamble, in the way of a woman who had decided to say a thing. He's good for you. Eliza looked at her. Silas, yes. Clara was not a woman who softened things for the sake of comfort. I want you to know that people see it. Not everyone says things out loud. But they see it. I'm not doing it for people to see, Eliza said. I know that, Clara said. I'm not saying you are. I'm saying it matters what people see. In this territory, a woman alone is a certain thing in people's minds, and it limits what they think she can do. A woman who isn't alone is a different thing. People will deal with you differently now. She paused. That's not romantic. It's just true. Eliza thought about this. It shouldn't matter, she said. No, Clara agreed. But it does, and you're practical enough to use what's true rather than waiting for what should be. Eliza drank her coffee. He's good for me, she said, because Clara had said something honest and deserved honesty back. And I think I'm good for him. I don't know how to say that without sounding like a person who knows what she has, Clara said. You can say that. After Clara left, Eliza sat at the table for a while and thought about what she'd said. I think I'm good for him. She had been careful not to make assumptions about this, careful not to build a story in which she was what had fixed something in Silas, because she was not in the habit of making herself the center of other people's narratives, and she understood that transformation, when it happened in a person, not to them. But she had watched him over the months since March. She had watched the quality of his silences change, not the frequency. He was still a quiet man, but the content. The old silences had the particular texture of a man who had made peace with absence. The new ones were different. They were the silences of a man who had something to come back to and knew it. She thought she was good for him the way the ranch was good for her, not by changing what she was, but by giving her something to be it in. On a Saturday evening in late August, Silas asked her to walk the east pasture with him, not to check anything, not for any practical reason, just to walk. This was new. He was not a man who walked without purpose, and she was not a woman who typically accepted invitations to purposeless walks, and so they walked the east pasture in the long late summer light, with the grass dry and golden around them, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was not uncomfortable. Then he stopped. She stopped beside him. The sun was going down behind the ridge to the west, and the pasture in front of them was the pasture she'd been clearing, and fencing all summer new posts running straight along the eastern boundary, the gate she'd had fitted in June, swinging true on its hinges. Her work, all of it, her land. I want to ask you something, Silas said. All right, she said. He looked at the pasture for a moment, not avoiding her, just arriving at the thing from the right direction. I've been thinking, he said, about what staying would look like. Actually staying, not Sunday to Sunday, he paused. I've been thinking about it since April, if I'm being accurate. Probably before that. She looked at him. Her pulse was doing something she noted and did not chase. I don't have property, he said. I'm not a man with things. I have temperance and my tools and whatever I've managed to save working the past 20 years, which is not nothing, but is not what a man should probably have to show at 55 either. He said this flatly, without self-pity, just as an accurate inventory. I don't think I can offer you what you might have expected to want when you were younger. I'm 35, she said. I'm not in my dotage. Don't talk to me about what I might have expected when I was younger as if that was a long time ago. He looked at her. Something in his expression was almost amused. No, he said. Fair enough. What are you asking? She said. I'm asking, he said carefully, whether you would want me to stay. Not on Sundays. Not working in the area with somewhere to be during the week. Here, he looked at the pasture, then back at her. I'm not a man who has done this. I want you to understand that. I don't know exactly how it works or what it looks like or whether I'll be good at it. I know how to work, and I know how to be honest, and I know how to show up when I say I will. That is what I have. That's quite a lot, actually, she said. Her voice was steady, which she was aware of and grateful for. Some people never manage one of those three things. Eliza, he said. Ask me plainly, she said. He looked at her. Will you let me stay? The pasture was quiet around them, the late light going warm and long across the grass she'd cleared herself, and the fence line she'd put in herself, and the gate that hung true. Her land, her work, her life, built from the ground up from what she'd refused to give up. She thought about what Clara had said, a woman who knows what she has. She thought about the letter her mother had written. That's quite a lot, actually. She thought about the 14 months of alone, and the 3 weeks of a man repairing her roof, and the slow, complicated months since, and all the Sunday suppers and the letters and the walks that had no destination and the conversations that went longer than planned. She thought about what she'd said in the yard in March, when she'd told him to stop deciding what other people deserved. She had meant it then. She meant it now. Yes, she said. I'll let you stay. He was quiet for a moment that she didn't try to fill. I'll need to talk to Coburn, he said, and Strand. I have jobs. Finish your job, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her. Then he nodded, the slow, settled nod that meant a thing was decided and didn't need more words. They stood in the east pasture as the sun finished going down, and the air turned the specific cool of a late August evening, when fall is a thought rather than a fact. And Eliza looked at her fence line running straight and true to the eastern boundary of her land, and thought about what staying meant. Not the word, not the idea of it, but the actual practice two people with worn-down edges and real histories, and the kind of damage that doesn't fully repair, trying to build something honest in the middle of a life that had already had other things in it. It would not be smooth. She knew that. She was not a smooth person, and he was not a simple one, and they would argue and they would misunderstand each other. And there would be mornings when the ranch's demands would crowd everything else out, and evenings when the weight of what they'd both survived would sit between them like a third presence. But she had built a fence that ran true in this pasture, post by post, and she had known going in that it would take longer than seemed reasonable and cost more than seemed fair, and require going back to fix things she thought she'd already finished. And it was standing. Some things were worth the work they required. She had learned that. She had earned learning it. Fall came in slow and then all at once, the way Montana falls did. By October, the herd count was the best it had been. In 2 years, the 3 steers from Hector had settled well, and she'd added 2 more in September from a sale east of town. And the cattle going into winter were in better condition than any year since Thomas. She had expanded the east pasture by 40 acres of usable grazing. The attorney had sent the retainer letter and filed it with the land office. And Bram Vickery had not spoken her name in any public place in Copper Hollow since April, which Eliza chose to interpret as a satisfactory outcome rather than a permanent one. Silas finished the Strand bunkhouse in September, delivered what he'd promised to Coburn, and settled into the ranch the way a man settles into a thing he's been circling for a long time, not all at once. Not without the occasional evidence of someone who is learning as they go, but honestly. He built a proper workshop in the far end of the barn, a space for his tools, organized the way his leather rolls were organized, everything in a known place, and from there he did local repair work, the kind that didn't require long absences, the kind that brought him home in the evening. Home was a word that arrived in his vocabulary around this time and surprised him each time it came, she thought. She noticed him catch himself using it, occasionally. And the catching himself was less frequent by November than it had been in September, which was progress. They were not perfect. She needed to say this, if only to herself, because she had a tendency to inventory what was working and minimize what wasn't, which was efficient but not honest. They got the details of living together wrong. Sometimes she was particular about her mornings in a way she hadn't known about herself until she had to share them. And he had a habit of working in the barn past dark, when something wasn't sitting right in his head and not saying so, which made her fill the absence with explanations that were usually wrong. They worked through these things the way people work through them badly. At first, better gradually, with occasional backsliding. But there was something underneath the imperfections that held. Not despite what they'd both been through exactly, but partly because of it. Two people who had spent real years carrying real weight alone had a different relationship with the truth than people who hadn't. They didn't dress things up. They didn't manage each other. When something was wrong, they said so clumsily sometimes, too directly sometimes, but they said it, and they'd both been alone long enough to understand that saying the wrong thing was not the same as the wrong thing being unsayable. In November, his sister wrote and said she was doing well. The freight job was working out for her husband. He had always been better at movement than stasis, it turned out, and being on the road suited him in a way that standing behind a counter never had. Margaret herself was taking in seamstress work and finding that she was better at it than she'd expected, which Silas said in his characteristically understated way meant she was probably excellent at it, his sister not being a woman who miscalibrated her own abilities downward. He read the letter to Eliza at the kitchen table after supper, which she noted without commenting on the ease of that. The way sharing a letter from family was now a thing he did without deliberating about it. "She sounds like herself," Eliza said. "She does," he said. "She sounds better than she has in years, actually." Things falling apart sometimes, the right things, the things that weren't working sometimes, that's not the worst thing that can happen to a person. He looked at her. "No," he said. "Sometimes it's the thing that was needed." She met his eyes and thought about all the things that had needed to fall apart for either of them to be sitting at this table. She didn't say this, it didn't need saying. The first hard snow came in late November, and when it came with intention, the kind of storm that says winter is not a rumor anymore and means it. Eliza had seen it building the day before and had spent the afternoon checking everything that needed to be checked, because she was still the woman who did that and probably always would be. That night the storm hit in full and the ranch held. The new ridge beam held. The barn held. The fence lines held. The cattle were in and accounted for, and the hay was sufficient, and the water troughs had been checked that afternoon, and everything that needed to be done had been done. She woke in the night to the sound of wind and lay still for a moment listening to it, doing the automatic inventory she'd done on 100 storm nights alone, roof, barn, cattle, fences, and found that the inventory came out the same place it always came out, holding. But this time, lying in the dark with the storm outside, she was not alone in the house. Silas was sleeping with the quiet economy of a man who was good at sleeping, which she'd discovered was a separate and valuable skill. He didn't stir for the wind. He knew the roof was sound because he'd built it that way, and that was enough for him. She lay in the dark and listened to the storm and to the house holding against it, and she thought about the woman who had lain in this same dark 14 months ago, running calculations at 2 a.m, because there was no one to share the weight of the not knowing. And she thought about what the distance between that woman and this moment had cost and what it had returned. It had cost her the easy version of things. The simpler story, the one where grief moved in a clean direction and recovery was a straight line, and needing people was a clean transaction rather than a complicated one. It had cost her the comfortable numbness of having decided who she was going to be and not revisiting it. What it had returned was harder to name. Not happiness exactly, though she was something that lived in the neighborhood of happiness. Not security, because she knew better than to use that word about anything in Montana. Something more like accuracy, like she was living in a version of her life that was true rather than adequate. Like the difference between a wall that was standing and a wall that was actually sound. She thought about Silas, that first day, pressing his hand flat against the siding of her house. Just feeling, not testing anything she could identify. Just confirming what was there. She had learned to do that with people eventually. To press her hand against the surface and feel what was actually holding rather than what looked like it should be. She turned onto her side and listened to the storm for another few minutes, and then, because she was a practical woman and morning would come whether she was rested for it or not, she went back to sleep. The storm passed by morning, as storms do. She got up before light, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the white quiet of the ranch. The ridge line of the house roof clean against the dawn sky. The fence lines visible under the snow. Everything where it should be. Silas came in while the coffee was still hot. Having already gone out to check the barn she'd heard him go, heard the door. Hadn't tried to stop him, and he came back in with cold on his jacket and the particular look of a man confirming a thing he'd already expected. "Cattle are fine," he said. "Barn's tight." "I know," she said. "You were up." "I checked before you did." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite amusement and was not quite tenderness, but was somewhere in the territory between them. "I know," he said. "I found your boot prints." She handed him a cup of coffee, and he took it, and they stood at the window together and looked at the ranch in the early morning snow. It was not a perfect life. The money would be tight again before spring. And Vickery was somewhere out there still being Vickery. And the north fence needed serious attention before the next hard winter, and she already knew it. And there would be losses she couldn't predict, and problems she couldn't see coming, the way there always were. But the roof was sound. The barn was tight. The cattle were in. And she was not standing at this window alone. She had stopped thinking of that as luck or accident or something she needed to be careful about pressing too hard. She had started thinking of it as something she had chosen, and that Silas had chosen, and that choosing again every day imperfectly, honestly, with the full awareness of what they were both still learning, was what made it real rather than temporary. She drank her coffee. Outside, the ranch waited for them the way it always did, patient, demanding, requiring everything she had, and somehow, most days, worth it. She thought about Silas, measuring that beam, how he'd said, the damage goes deeper than the surface, how that had been true of the beam and true of everything else she'd had to deal with in the months since, and how the answer in every case had been the same, not to pretend the depth wasn't there, but to open it up and do the work. She thought about the calculation he'd told her he'd been getting wrong. A man who spent his life determining whether damaged structures could still carry weight, who had been afraid to apply the same assessment to himself, not because the assessment would have been cruel, but because he'd been afraid of what yes still sound would mean. Afraid of the work that comes after yes. She understood this. She had been afraid of the same thing in herself. But you cannot make an honest measurement if you leave out part of the structure. They had both finally remembered to include themselves in the calculation. Outside, the snow on the ranch caught the first real light of morning and held it, and the ridge line of the repaired house ran clean and true against the brightening sky, and the east pasture fence stood straight along its boundary, and the gate at the new entrance swung clean on its hinges, and all of it, every board, every post, every replaced nail and rehung gate and reseated shingle was evidence of what happened when you refused to leave something broken that could be made right. This was what she had. It was enough. It was, when she added it up honestly, considerably more than enough.